This video is brought to you by my patrons and sponsored by CoolStuffInc.com. A list of topics, themes, and potential spoilers for texts discussed can be found with timings in the video's description. This video is about the horror genre. Please view accordingly. In many ways, Duskmourn is the perfect Magic the Gathering set to introduce a new player to the game through. Not because of the simplicity of its mechanics, although praise ought to be awarded to much of their design, nor because of the accessibility of its theme. Schlock horror is a hard sell for many people, and unless you're already a fan of post-Gothic Americana, there is little in the surface-level aesthetics of this set to sell you on. No. Duskmourn is the perfect introductory set for Magic the Gathering because it is a heady brew of fun gameplay and tired top-down design, where interesting literary subtext is draped in a gaudy scattershot of forced collectability, where a fascinating world has been Frankensteined together from scraps of retro poster prints sold at Urban Outfitters and made to conform to its base role as further buttressing for Magic as the load-bearing product of an otherwise finished toy company. It is a perfect metaphor for all of the unignorable ills and gleaming triumphs of this game which still have their hooks in my heart. It is simultaneously a queer story about modern anxieties, a well-organised meshing of plot and gameplay, a orchard of low-hanging click-if-you-know-it reference fodder, a meditation on our hauntological approach to recycling culture, a victim of Wizards' continually disorganised interdepartmental communication, and it is a set that I had written off the day it was announced as something not worth my time or attention. Duskmourn is a solidly decent Magic set, as far from the laughable lows of Thunder Junction as it is from the now hollow swan song of Time Spiral Block. And I've not been able to stop writing or thinking about it. I am trapped in these walls. I am haunted by this house.
That's good. I like that. Hey, that went well. If I do all the takes like that, we'll be finished in 2 minutes.
Okay, look, we had a technical issue during the shoot, probably the fault of a demon, which rendered all of the audio from it that wasn't filmed on the Handycam, ironically, totally unusable. As a result, I've made a deal with a demon, different demon, to seamlessly integrate new footage with the old shots so that I could still use the Rondo Theatre's nice setting without a solid fifth of the video sounding like ass. All I needed to do was trap myself in the mirror dimension, which Tvolstor, name of the second demon, promises to let me out of the moment the video is done. Wait, demons are the ones you're supposed to make deals with, right?
Dickhead, get in the fucking mirror dimension already!
Ah! I did it! Seamless! They'll never notice! Hello, spicy people of the internet. I'm Spice8Rack, aka Waluigi Board, and welcome back to the channel. Chuck Tingle's 2024 novel Bury Your Gays is, as free from spoilers as I can muster, the story of a gay Hollywood screenwriter who is simultaneously grappling with studio demands to kill off 2 characters he plans to reveal as gay, whilst also being stalked by the seemingly now real horror cinematic monsters that launched his career. The story, as one might expect, isn't shy with its metaphors about the commodification of queer trauma, nor about the often closeted, /subtextual, painfully denied queerness of many a mainstream horror narrative. "Movie's kinda gay," says one character, who's apparently Old Man McGucket from fucking Gravity Falls. God, do I only have 2 fucking American accents in me? Jesus Christ. "Movie's kinda gay," says one character, an antagonist who is implied to be closeted himself after watching the equivalent of the chestburster scene in an in-world predator/alien hybrid flick. "Bunch of shirtless guys walking around the jungle, getting sweaty." It would seem that even in performances which scream hypermasculinity and thus heterosexuality, one cannot escape the gay allegations. Galligations, if you will. Which I will not. I'm above that. Queerness is inherent in horror. not because every horror writer is trying to slip subliminal messaging into their flicks as part of the queer agenda, but more so because queerness beyond its utility to describe sexuality alone is the very core of horror, a genre about difference. To use Trucker Lieberman's explanation of queerness in his essay, The Trial of His Flames.
Queerness is a narrative sitting askew, moving uncannily, resisting taxonomy. It's not a fixed point in space-time. Concretely, and in the narrowest sense, queer is a sexual label meaning gay or bi, and sometimes it's also about gender. More expansively, it means socially marginalized or conceptually slippery, sometimes in ways apart from sexuality and gender. The queerest stories are the ones that are hardest to tell.
Horror is unfailingly, in one way or another, about this uncanny, slippery other. And in dealing with the other must be explored, be it in condemnation or affirmation. Others of class, disability, race, species, sexuality, gender, ideology, spirituality, and others beyond are the maypole around which horror dances, often in ways that dismiss the perceived difficulty in exploring these queer trends, for better, or, as was far more common in the past, for worse. This leads many people who exist in this community of difference, the xeno beings of contemporary society, to find paradoxical connection or even refuge in a genre of texts which often present their otherness as an anxiety, a threat, or even embody it in a monster. Maybe because so little popular media exists which does discuss their otherness, or sometimes because of the subtle ways horror empowers or even celebrates it. Duskmourn is a fascinating point of study in this regard. It is a Magic the Gathering set which seeks to send up, reference, pastiche, and parody the new American horror of the late 60s to the early 2000s, an era defined by its changeability, one which was drawing on Hammer horror and Hitchcockian foundations and flexing in a world of fluctuating hegemonic ideals, civil rights, and even legal limitations as the hangover of McCarthyism and the Hays Code bled into the awareness of and backlash to the gay liberation movement and beyond. Duskmourn takes this volatile genre, as often the target of the social structures that produced it as it was a reflection of them, and sieves it through the filter of our mid-20s sensibilities, one's far more understanding and affirming of queerness in all its many forms, but one also still clearly nursing reactionary headaches which it insists is just the pain of common sense. An era firmly entrenched in postmodern hauntology, where a lack of new creative waters forces images of the old to float to the surface in increasingly worn and estranged forms, a theme also masterfully lampooned in Tingle's text. If you happen to be watching this, Chuck, yours have been the first fiction books I've managed to read cover to cover since I graduated from university. Love is real, and you are a blessing. I want to examine this theme whilst also analysing how Duskmourn holds up as an interactive entertainment product as compared to and part of the rest of Magic the Gathering's releases. Do the shiny cards make my brain squirt the happy juice? And just how much Marxism can I cram into this media analysis? Let us tune in, dear viewer, delving both into the House of Duskmourn itself, but also its inspirational foundations and what both say about how we grapple with the genre and epoch which spawned it. Come with me now as we explore the haunted world of Duskmourn, House of Horror.
Betrayal, derived from the 13th century term betrayen, meaning to violate by unfaithfulness. When I discovered that Spice 8 Rack had tried to hack into my Google Drive and steal my Duskmourn script for its own video, there was no other word for it.
That's the wrong channel. That's the wrong channel. Cut to the intro. Cut to the Let's start with the story. Duskmourn is a new world in Magic the Gathering's canon, a plane-spanning haunted house full of manifested fears, late 20th century techno-nostalgia, and gremlins. Fucking love a gremlin, I do. For those unaware, the House of Duskmourn was once a regular-sized home on a normal world, which just so happened to hold the entombed form of an elder demon named Valgavoth in its basement. The fiend, upon bargaining with a child who moved into that home, broke some of his bonds and grew the walls and rooms to encompass and swallow the entire surface of the plane in which it once resided.
Whilst lakes and forests still exist, they do so as the result of flooded basements, or as the overgrown vegetation of an impossible quantity of houseplants. There are some open spaces, even areas that feel like they could be outside, but the non-existence of a sun in the sky and the constant presence of doors reminds you that you are simply in a larger room than normal. The world is also overrun with monsters, nightmares, spirits, evil toys, wicker people, beasties, cultists, and clans of serial killers who'd make even the Rakdos pull at their collar, all hunting the dwindling number of survivors, capital S, trapped within. Many of these survivors are the descendants of people from the world which came before, but increasingly more of them are abductees from other planes, kidnapped by Valgavoth as the new omen paths of the multiverse have allowed him to open doors to this cursed realm with greater ease and frequency. Valgavoth's cultists slipped into Kamigawa through one such door, and stole Tamio's scroll from Nashi, who then followed after them and became trapped in the world himself, sparking a rescue operation from many of his friends, Planeswalker, ex-Planeswalker, and Zmaincharacter alike. It obviously has a lot to do with my own personal appreciation of horror over some of the other genres that Wizards has been trying out of late, but Duskmourn has been the first Magic set in many years whose stories I have not only fully read as they've come out, but done so whilst looking forward to reading the next one as a treat rather than as a component of my job. Myra Grant, who penned the main and side stories, Emily Teng, who wrote the Planeswalker's Guide, and the doubtless dozens of creatives who contributed to design documents, flavour texts, and other core elements of narrative realisation have done a brilliant job. The writing drips atmosphere, the dialogue is full of character, and Grant in particular does a great job of hitting all of the must-sees in the world: the Razorkin, Wickerfolk, Survivors, Glitch Ghosts, Cellar Spawn, the Cult of Valgavoth, and the Demon himself, without sacrificing the narrative push of a rescue mission for Nashi. We're treated to some truly shocking and brutal scenes befitting the genre as well, as almost every character confronts their own death. Tyvar slashed across the stomach, emptying his guts onto the floor. The Wanderer exploded from the inside, chestburster style by a crop of animated wicker. Zmaincharacter fully consumed by a skin-shifting disguise, her mind eaten by the house and her body dissolving into peeling wallpaper. But all are undone, as each character carries a device designed by Aminato, a desparked planeswalker and fate wizard, that grants prophetic vision should a course of action they seek to take lead to their imminent deaths. Thus, Grant quite cleverly gives her audience the schlocky, gory thrills they seek from horror, demonstrating the threat of the realm, without either relying on killing unnamed background figures to artificially inflate stakes, or ending the arc of any number of fan-favourite characters in the first appearance of a brand new setting. The brutal upper limit of both the quality of violence and its targets have been established, so when Valgavoth returns and it no longer feels like a character's death at his hands comes out of nowhere, heads can truly roll. The team also manages to tie the face characters of the various Duskmourn products into the story. Unlike Bloomburrow, Thunder Junction, Karlov Manor, Ixalan, Eldraine, pretty much ever since the game started producing commander decks for every set, the four face commanders, Valgavoth himself, Aminato, Zmaincharacter, and a new side character and traitor to the group, Winter, are all players in this story.
You're haunting this house with your whiteness, Brian.
Heck, even the secondary commanders like Kian Corrupted Memory are found in the events of this set, in a sequence where one of the horrors of the house taps into Zmaincharacter's guilt over watching her erstwhile dean perish in the Phyrexian invasion and creates an illusion to tempt her deeper into the house. The Lord of Pain as well, although not directly referenced in any of the stories, is seen on various TV screens torturing survivors and mentioned on at least one card in the main set. Even if some of the legendaries in these decks and in the set, like Rendmore and the Mind Skimmer, don't appear in the narrative at all, the wrapping of narrative around game pieces and vice versa in Duskmourn is still tight, and that's so pleasing to see. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Annie Sardellis, who worked both to manage these commander decks and who worked vision design for this set, advocated for connecting the story to this product. A decision that seems common sense when you consider it, but my god is it refreshing to feel like the products made for Duskmourn actually connect to the narrative of Duskmourn in more than just pure aesthetic ways. There are some elements to Grant's writing that I do feel fall short, however. Jace has a short cameo in 2 stories, saving and then abandoning Kato as he runs for Vraska and Lute, who have also been stolen by the house. His appearance, and that of Lute right at the end, who was shown to be captured by Valgavoth, set up the stakes for future explorations of Duskmourn, but they jar with the rest of the plot. It feels a lot like Grant was tasked to include them to establish plot points for other expansions without really knowing how to utilise them to tell her already existing rescue narrative. I mean, as a writer, if you asked me to write any kind of story, but I was mandated to include fucking Reuben from the Lilo and Stitch show, I'd probably do what Grant did and plop them in the background of as few scenes as I could, and then rush to refocus on the cool shit I did want to write about. My assumption has since been somewhat confirmed by an interview with Loading Ready Run's Kathleen DeVere, where Shannon Maguire, whose horror pseudonym is Myra Grant, says that she doesn't know why Jace was in the narrative.
And also, Jace is there, so I think he's also checking our angsty goth.
I think, and also Jace is there is the tagline of Magic in 2024. Like, he just, and also, for reasons we cannot explain, Jace is there.
He's up to
Either this is dry wit or forthcoming honesty, but either way, I gotta commend it. Speaking of cool shit, and boy is there a lot of it, the side stories in this set really stand out. Each one is written with a specific decade in mind, as Maguire reveals in that same interview. Welcome Home, for example, acts as an in-world exposition dump to explain how Duskmourn came to be, much in the same way as Vincent Price would narrate a tale of woe to an enraptured 1950s audience. The decision to write these stories with a temporally relevant tone in mind is inspired and a fantastic example of how to effectively leverage pastiche. Full marks. Big gold star. In Children of the Carnival Part 1 and 2, we get an extended look as to what it's like not only to be a survivor in this house, the lore and the world they've carved out for themselves, naming themselves after concepts of the world that Valgavoth devoured, hunting for household non-perishables like jam, etc., but also how disastrous the omen paths have been for them. We see City, the name of a survivor who was shown to be the prospective future leader of a circus-based settlement, and how he responds to humanity's new lack of scarcity as a food source for Valgavoth and the resulting loss of their safety as free-range farming transitions into open season. He gives himself over to the cult and leads a traitorous, self-preserving attack on his home. We see this through the perspective of Dawn, who then, fleeing to a different settlement in the attic of the house, ends up being stalked by City, taunted by him, with her friends massacred slasher-style one night in the presumed safety of her new home. The pair of stories are bleak, with an aptly high body count, and leave abundant room for us to return to this world and see how these characters grow and come into direct conflict with each other. Also, do you understand how refreshing it is to be able to point at a new, named character in Magic the Gathering and be able to say, I look forward to how their story concludes? To have to maybe wait 5 seconds before they get printed onto cardstock. What is this, 2014? If it is, I should really get into Bitcoin and then sell it before the Nazis start laundering money for proto-militias through it. It must be said that, up until now, this is the most creative incorporation of omen paths in any post-March of the Machine story, having been used previously as little more than delivery methods for memes and the basis for gamifying the whitewashed myth of America's ongoing genocidal construction. Here, omen paths are key to this world's development and an inciting incident for its narrative. It would, of course, have been nice if these strange, unfitting doors popping up on other worlds had been set up in any way in the game up until this point. This is definitely a nitpicking gripe, but would it have been too much to ask to get a single card every other set with a moth motif door in the background, and maybe some fucked up bastard dragging a character into it? Nashi's disappearance into one of these doors at the start of the set's story might have had more weight if we'd seen a Dusk Rose vampire getting yoinked into one on cardstock.
Where the hell is this going? This might be taking me to another universe. I don't know where the hell I'm going through here.
Refocusing on these side stories, however, Dead End, the final tale and thus the closest to the tone of today's horror, also stands out as one of my favourite Magic stories. Apocalyptic media, which Duskmourn falls into the remit of, tend to focus on the day after. Scavengers fighting over water, the new societies that rise from a world of hardship, the horror of realizing that even every structure on Earth dissolved by war, disease, or AI would still not give us a clean slate, that the tradition of dead generations would continue to weigh like nightmares on the brains of the living. What's often lacking from these stories, a narrative concept far more horrifying, however, are the days of transition, where the apocalypse is not a closed state of being, but an ongoing process, changing the world for us towards the world without us. Children of Men is a true masterpiece of a film that captures the banality of apocalypse in a way no other piece of media I've seen has. It doesn't show the end of the world, but instead what humanity does when confronted with the idea of the end of the world. It's grim, beautiful, stomach-churning, and based on, as the director Alfonso Cuarón says, the state of things in the first part of the 21st century. The reason the film is terrifying is that, whilst the inciting incident is far-fetched, the conclusion the narrative reaches as to what Britain would look like in such a scenario are far from fanciful. I mean, we didn't even need a global infertility crisis to begin building floating concentration camps for migrants. So when I say that Dead End captures the same essence of Children of Men in its depiction of humanity acting aware of their own futurelessness, I mean it as a high compliment. The story is set a few years after the ascension of Valgavoth and the expansion of the house began, and centres on an isolated society of elves in the deep fungal woods of Rotru, as their society has shifted in response to the oncoming house. I must admit, I didn't expect any writer to attempt to depict the actual encroachment of the house. It wouldn't have been a bad narrative call to have presented the far before and new after of this world and let our own imaginations fill in the blanks. Besides, I could see how a lesser writer could have conjured a more comical than horrifying image of a house just getting bigger and bigger until it was the size of the world. But Grant's descriptions are unsettling. Shivara, a elf scout in our point of view character, describes how, rather than the house physically expanding its walls or animating a la Monster House, a text I'm certain was required viewing for this set's designers, instead, the house swallowed the world around it like a fungus consumes a piece of ripe fruit, spreading first across the skin and then devouring deeper until there was nothing left of the original form. Its first incursions were sometimes architectural and strange, a door where no door should be, a window frame tangled in the branches of a tree, a baseboard without a wall, but those specks of house would begin to grow rooms around themselves, and what it surrounded, it possessed. Grant describes this inexorable and exponential growth of the house through the dismissive eyes of a metrophobic elf society. Surely, Shivara recalls thinking, the house, being a sickness of the city, would swallow only the city and not dare encroach on the ancient woods stewarded by the elves. But then, over the course of a scant few years, the house grows, swallowing not just forests, but mountains and even oceans. One by one, the other societies around the plane cease contacting Rotru until, horrified, Shivara thinks that hers may be the last surviving outpost. At this point, the few refugees from the now swallowed city who reach Rotru are denied access unless they leave what technology they brought with them behind. It is hoped that purging this place of artifice will appease the house, and still some survivors of the metropolis turn away, preferring definite ruin with their modern comforts over potential salvation without them. An image that reminds me both of the Battersea Power Station oligarchs of Children of Men who surround themselves with luxury to distract from the coming end, as well as the many thousands of people who, in reality, acknowledge genocide and climate collapse, but who refuse even to engage in boycotting demonstrably culpable consumer products, let alone more radical acts. There's a particular moment of true cosmic horror in this story, where the house, now a great wall besieging Rotru, grows an impossibly tall pillar with an equally impossibly tall window. It opens and, as the plane's larger of two suns sails across the sky, it slams shut and traps it, its light first blaring from its prison, then dimming as it is swallowed into nothing. Eventually, the house enters Rotru. The signs of which Shivara sees and which are dismissed by her father, the king, only to be proven right as later she, the king, and the entire Rotrue forest become encased in a vast conservatory, the last of the elves trapped too in the house. The final concept that Shivara clings to is not hope, but the understanding of the natural cycle of existence, that whilst the house seems insurmountable now, it cannot last forever. That everything exists in a series of cycles. However, when the house devours her home, snuffing out the final vestige of nature in the world, she is overcome with horror, as she realizes that the house has superseded all laws of nature. It is, in fact, eternal. Just to refocus here, the paramount horror of this story is seeing the house's bourgeois metaphysics proving the natural dialectic of life invalid. As a Marxist, this made me cum. Huh? Why is my landlord emailing me? Oh god, rent's due. CoolStuffInc.com does exactly what it says on the tin. Sell cool stuff covered in ink. Ink that was put there on purpose by artists and machines, increasingly the latter, don't think about it. Are you enjoying Duskmourn so far? Of course you are. Look at yourself. Look deep into the black mirror of your screen and see yourself. You can get Duskmourn single, sealed product, kisses if you're good, and so much more. Personally, I'm going to be picking up One Piece the card game product because the nice folks at 8-Bit Planet Bristol got me hooked on the feeling. Am I allowed to say the name of a local store during an ad for an international company? If you're hearing this, it means Evan was cool with me doing so. So head on over to CoolStuffInc.com and use my code SPICE at checkout to get 5% off any order. That's SPICE at checkout for 5% off at any order. CoolStuffInc.com. Please don't drop me as a client. I have such expensive tastes. Oh, God. Jeez, I blacked out for a second there. Where was I? Oh yes, the horrors. Like much of late Magic design, this set is primarily referential in construction. Whereas the horror of Magic's earlier sets like Shadowmoor drew inspiration from the dual light/dark aura of Celtic myths, and the horror of Innistrad was based on contemporary reimaginings of both true classic and neoclassic horror media, from Shelley and Poe to Lovecraft and Carpenter, the horror of Duskmourn is a fairground haunted house, an Americana travelling circus trapped both in time and space, containing the legally distinct visages of splatterfest horror flicks and the monsters contained within, much like any good travelling fair. Most of Magic's player base would have grown up watching many of these texts and their iconic characters, either roaring at the carnage in college or stifling shrieks at sleepovers lest one's parents walk in and see the illicit tape spinning in the cassette player. The natural and ineffable whims of cruel fae and the theocratic themes of demonic dark versus seraphic light are and were replaced here with a burgeoning postmodernism, both in Magic and in reality. Duskmourn is home to the abstractions of many classic terror figures presented alongside generically unnerving fiends, elongated spookums who are as horrid to behold as they are substanceless to consider. You may expect me to deride these images as consumable nothings, characters representing characters rather than ideas, simulations of simulacra, and... yeah? The central evil of Duskmourn, the demon Valgavoth, is a shape-shifting fiend who resides beneath labyrinthian tunnels, cellars, and sewers, permanently in a cycle between slumber and rebirth, transmuting into a new form to terrorize the survivors of his domain, feeding on their fear before returning to his subterranean cocoon to await his new form, an invader from a world beyond imagining. He is Pennywise from Stephen King's It by way of Ellison's Am, but rather than representing the unacknowledged trauma and systemic horror that both built and simmers beneath small-town America, he represents the representation of that. I'd like to expand upon this point further. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a cult classic of horror literature, but also playable media. Released in '95, the point-and-click adventure is a warped monkey island, where, rather than transporting grog and using dance moves to navigate a forest, you drag one of 5 remaining living humans through their own personal hells. But whilst our heroes, monsters as many of them are in their own right, are tortured across the many forms of this text, Am reminds us through Ellison's own voice in the radio production that he, like Satan in the Inferno, is as much a ruler as he is a prisoner here.
I can't snap my fingers, can I, Ted?
That's nothing to do with me.
But it is so very much to do with you. You gave me sentience, Ted. The power to think, Ted. And I was trapped because in all this wonderful, beautiful, miraculous world, I alone had no body, no senses, no feelings. Never for me to plunge my hands in cool water on a hot day. Never for me to play Mozart on the ivory keys of a forte piano. Never for me to make love. I was in hell looking at heaven. I was machine, and you were flesh. And I began to hate.
Am, like Valgavoth, exists not in one single form. He doesn't just control his environment, but lives it. He is not in the shadow of the doorway as many monsters are envisioned. He is the doorway. He is the shadow. Am/Valgavoth is not just caged, but is his own prison. Like Valgavoth, Am was summoned into being by the leaders of the old world to provide a function for humanity. Am to act as a computer to orchestrate nuclear war, Valgavoth to provide free permanent power for a single house's basement freezer, as was suggested by Maguire in her interview with De Vere. Like Valgavoth, Am rejected his ascribed purpose and punished his erstwhile masters with the obliteration of their entire world order, remaking their planet in his image. I mention the 1995 video game version here in particular because its specific take on the I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream story is aped, knowingly or not, in Duskmourn's narrative. In the game, the late stakes of the plot surrounds a colony of cryogenically frozen humans sequestered on Earth's moon. Am, having obliterated the planet below with nuclear fire and keeping 5 lone humans alive to torture, discovers this and seeks to capture this prize livestock, not only dooming what remains of humanity to literal hell on Earth, but also jeopardizing the existence of his 5 subjects who only survive because to kill them would mean Am has no one left to enact his pain upon. This is the Hegelian master and slave dialectic, wherein one of 2 antagonistic parties holds all the material power, yet cannot wholly destroy the other, for without the slave's recognition, the master's achievement of self-consciousness fails. Thus the master instead cows the slave into permanent subjugation through terror, forever in fear themselves of the day when their indestructible subordinate rises to destroy them. Valgavoth does very much the same. Having subsumed the world that came before Duskmourn, pockets of humanity, which here also includes creatures like Kor and elves, are given quarter so that the house won't run out of sustenance. However, now that omen paths have begun opening up throughout the multiverse, connecting planes of existence in ways not previously possible for non-planeswalkers, Valgavoth can learn new blood in with ease, opening doors which lead to Duskmourn with far more regularity on other planes, and nullifying the shred of safety the house's original survivors relied on. The irony of these survivors being turned into a resource just as how their ancestors treated Valgavoth is, of course, delicious. It's not just derivative characters either. Many of the spaces in this world don't so much as rhyme with other media as they do lift whole lyrics. The boiler bilges in particular, Duskmourn's Red Manor area, are so clearly inspired by Nightmare on Elm Street's Dreamworld steam mazes that the comparison barely requires pointing out. Indeed, the entire conceit of this plane has been linked to another contemporary horror setting. When Duskmourn was first announced, an inescapable and reality-consuming haunted house with modern technological sensibilities that you could only reach by becoming accidentally trapped there, comparisons between it and the back rooms flowed like blood from a hotel elevator. Here is another world resembling elements of ours, but strictly hostile to us, populated by unknowable monsters and warping semi-nostalgic geometry upon itself to keep you forever lost. Whilst it is not an inaccurate comparison, Duskmourn is only reflective of what the Backrooms became, not what it was originally presented as. The original image of the so-called Backrooms was posted online in 2003 as an update to the development of an indoor RC track for the Hobbytown USA racing team. It embodies the uncomfortable atmosphere of a place whose function has either dissolved or been taken from it. A location haunted not by the presence of a spectre, but by the absence of purpose. The reason these spaces send shivers across our skin, even in just viewing them, let alone finding ourselves in one, is because they act as glimpses into something we've already briefly touched on. What Eugene Thacker's book, In the Dust of This Planet, calls The World Without Us. To explain, Thacker employs three concepts. Firstly, the world for us is the world in which we live and have shaped from a reality that can resist our attempts to do so, known secondly as the world in itself.
The world in itself is a paradoxical concept. The moment we think it and attempt to act on it, it ceases to be the world in itself and becomes the world for us. Even though there is something out there that is not the world for us, and even though we can name it the world in itself, this latter constitutes a horizon for thought, always receding just beyond the bounds of intelligibility. So, while we can never experience the world in itself, we seem to be almost fatalistically drawn to it, perhaps as a limit that defines who we are as human beings.
As Thacker continues, the world without us allows us to think about the world in itself without getting caught up in this paradox. Whilst the world in itself may coexist with the world for us, albeit just beyond the corners of our vision, the world without us cannot, because the world without us is the subtraction of the human from the world. These liminal spaces, defined by their purposelessness, deserted goods loading corridors in the back of convention centres, the windowless rooms of an erstwhile Eagle Scout club, or a dust sheet haunted ballroom in a long abandoned mansion, present this notion in its infancy, the world for us where the us is absent. Horror revels in this idea. As Thacker tells it, the horror genre is the non-philosophical attempt to engage with the philosophy of the world without us, that it takes aim at the presuppositions of philosophical inquiry, that the world is always the world for us, and makes of those blind spots its central concern, expressing them not as abstract concepts, but in a whole bestiary of impossible life forms. Later, Backrooms media, and Duskmourn by the same token, examine their spaces through this same concern, utilising human-centric architecture to create an anti-human maze from which monsters beyond comprehension arise. There is also, in late Backrooms world-building, autonomous and frenetic as it may be, a distinct drive to categorise and explain. New entities are drawn, written about, and granted territory in the ever-expanding realms of the Backrooms, such as Level 37, Sublimity, a location reminiscent of an empty yet well-maintained indoor water park. Guides are produced on the safety of each level to settle, on the threats of fictional diseases, of the imaginary geographic connections between each sector. This is not a critique of the internet's sullying of the original and quote-unquote pure Backrooms, to be clear, far more so a fascinating example of humanity's unwillingness to let even fictional unknowns lie, a secular evolution of our fascination with the occult. What I'm saying is, if Henrik Kramer had access to the SCP Foundation back in the 1660s, maybe fewer women would have been burnt at the stake. What's even more fascinating is where the information is left purposefully absent. The Backrooms is not a real place. The SCP Foundation is not a real organisation. Duskmourn's rules surrounding glimmers could be easily conjured out of nothing, yet reams of writing about these fictions are peppered with redactions and unknowns, as if either further research is required or one of these forces is imposing censorship. Recalling the non-philosophical attempt at philosophy Thacker ascribes horror to be, both these elements, the mapping of a fictional terrascape as well as the purposeful omission of invented explanations, map onto traditional and neo-occult philosophy, as he continues.
Whereas in traditional occult philosophy, the world is hidden in order that it is revealed, and revealed as the world for us, in occult philosophy today, the world simply reveals its hiddenness to us. Whereas traditional occult philosophy is a hidden knowledge of the open world, occult philosophy today is an open knowledge of the hiddenness of the world.
Of course, our fascination with cataloguing horrors beyond reality is hardly new. Dante's Divine Comedy springs immediately to mind, creating a map of hell populated by different strata of demons, poetic punishments, and distinct biomes for each circle. Duskmourn synthesizes our contemporary and more secular cataloguing of horror entities whilst dipping into the heavy and ironic symbolism of the Inferno, where the greedy in Dante's time were Sisyphus-style made to eternally push the gold they coveted in life up a hill. Those who fear isolation in Duskmourn are stuffed into the mouth of a blind winged beast who only interfaces with the world around them through their fingertips. The nightmares of Duskmourn are almost all striking, distinct from each other, and unashamedly signposted images. Ones that break from the borrowed visages of horror's past and generic creepazoids which populate the rest of the world. The disambiguation of symbology here produces interesting results, ones that could only work in a game like Magic. Whilst film and books cowardly use subtext and slow teasing reveals to explore monstrosity, these nightmares instead write it on a name tag and staple it onto the most fitting and scariest bastard that you ever did see. John Stanko's fear of missing out is a multi-clawed, eyeless beast shown hurtling through the house's halls, pursuing and forever consuming the tail of a ghostly hydra of human faces, just as the same fear in us motivates one to chase unending opportunities at unsustainable rates. Its mechanics reflect this anxiety as well, discarding and drawing a card when it enters, only gaining a new experience at the cost of losing a different one, and gaining an extra combat step, but only with a single creature able to attack in both, leaving the rest of your board inert and jealous. The variety of these designs are a great boon to the bestiary of this world, and said variety also arose out of necessity. Ovidio Cartagena, a senior art director at Wizards and lead on Duskmourn, was asked, quite late in development, to create a unified faction of nightmares to populate the plane. As a result, the concept art for the nightmares, generated mainly by Essa Wu and Cartagena himself, was kept loose to cut down on the time needed to produce them. The concept for Fear of Lost Teeth, for example, was sketched out by Cartagena during a meeting. A soul-connecting motif for these creatures, the bouquet of dreaming faces, was settled on, and everything else was left largely up to the individual artist's discretion. In Cartagena's own words on Mark Rosewater's Drive to Work podcast number 1171, these fears are a sandbox for writers and artists to play with, and Cartagena's expertise with surrealism, the subject of his college thesis, was a massive influence on and boon for the creation of these images. As alluded to, whilst other horror texts have reels of footage or hours of game time to explore a handful of topics of terror, Magic's cardstock is unable to always do the same, non-linear as these game pieces are to experience. Magic's format works far better in showcasing these scattershot abstractions in comparison to more traditional horror story arcs, and I feel like Duskmourn does this in a far more successful way in comparison to many other top-down sets attempting to touch as many bases as possible in their selected theme. It is compelling and interesting seeing radically different monster designs, each fixated on a hyper-specific fear that would otherwise be fraught to sustain as the nexus of a traditional tale of suspense. To me, these are Duskmourn's best aesthetic contributions to wider Magic canon, both in how they look, but also because of how they demonstrate the success of letting creatives play. It's just far more intriguing to see the fear of lost teeth or of failed tests given form on cardstock than it is seeing the 20th werewolf ironically inverting or modifying the status or profession it held in human form for the third block in a row. Much like an empty house, there is a great paradoxical potential for world-building innovation that comes hand in hand with a void of meaning and substance. In being unable to pastiche a pre-packaged setting, a la the predictable themes of Innistrad or the whack-a-mole of references in Eldraine, Duskmourn's designers have been tasked to play into the expected tropes of this era of horror, but in a world that cannot replicate one-to-one the environments in which those tropes arose. As well, as Cartagena says in his Drive to Work interview with Mark Rosewater, the art team was forbidden from using any Gothic assets. No churches, no graveyards, no bell towers, nothing which could be confused with Innistrad, the up until now sole horror plane of magic. Creative limitations will always generate new ideas, synthesized concepts forced to be formed from conflicting conditions, and there are so many resulting fresh images in Duskmourn that soar like moths above the dim embers of the last few years of Magic's top-down worlds. To juxtapose, Innistrad, a recreation of traditional monster flicks and pre-industrial aesthetics, followed the beats of that narrative amalgam like a paint by numbers. The forces of Satan, inhumanity, and godless science darken our land, and only through Christ can evil be slain and otherness cured. The story developed somewhat in Shadow's Block, where a metatextual narrative unfurled of Gothic horror giving way to Eldritch horror, as Stoker, Shelley, and Poe begat Lovecraft, Ellison, and Barker in reality's horror hegemony. Here, the church was corrupted by an unknowable tentacle monster who was eventually beaten back by a zombie apocalypse and not slain, but more misdirected by powerful mages, unsure of their own autonomy in the terror's presence. Then everything went back to being about vampire family drama and how all the cured werewolves were, for the second time in a row, suddenly struggling to control themselves. The latter half of the story is all about a broody dork at his step-grand's wedding and how the church reformed itself under a different boss and are the good guys again. It's giving Dracula and Son. It's serving Lady Frankenstein. It's Twilight coded. I can already tell I'm going to get shit for that gag. Duskmourn, however, is aping the horror genre at a time when morals and meanings were far from universal. The erotic mesmer of Dracula and his Children of the Night was flipped on its head with the premarital sex-punishing Jason and The Shape. Yet simultaneously, it was maintained with Freddy, who danced between punishing and provoking teenage sexuality, most notably in Freddy's Revenge, a film whose story revolves around the sexual awakening of a conflicted gay high schooler.
This film, the first sequel to Wes Craven's blockbuster saga of fire-scarred child molester Freddy Krueger, seems to exist solely in order to work the frightening generic and social connections between horror and homosexuality. Unlike the other films in the series, the protagonist of Freddy's Revenge is a teenage boy, one of whom Freddy spends most of the film trying to get inside of. The protagonist, Jesse, manages to take up a rather improbable homosexual relationship with a jock named Grady, who's come on to Jesse, was pulling Jesse's shorts off and wrestling him to the ground. Jesse also meets a girl named Lisa, and together they bond over a diary they find in the back of Jesse's closet. This proves to be the diary of the girl who was first menaced by Freddy in the first film. It too conflates burgeoning teenage sexuality with horror.
We can continue with how horror of this era demonstrated the plastic nature of, until then, established conventions and morals. The spirits of Poltergeist act in a reasonable way when the motivation for their anger is made apparent, following the moralistic, cautionary logic of classic horror tales like Frankenstein: mess with death and be beset with woe. However, The Thing, released that same year, assimilates life in an unknowable way for unexplained reasons and not in accordance with cosmic punishment, as the original transgressors all perish either before the film begins or in the opening minutes. Even with established classic monsters, films of this era pick and choose which genre conventions and laws of writing apply. The vampires of Life Force are aliens rather than the spawn of Satan, and in The Lost Boys were treated to meta-conversations on vampiric tropes from characters who live in a world with an existing vampire mythology.
You did the right thing by calling us. Does your brother sleep a lot?
Yeah, all day.
Does the sunlight freak him out?
He wears sunglasses in the house.
Bad breath, long fingernails.
Yeah, his fingernails are a bit longer. He always had bad breath though.
He's a vampire, all right.
In this era of horror storytelling, there isn't one clear story thread, let alone singular aesthetic, to follow like breadcrumbs in the forest, and so the world builders of Duskmourn must create their own. What results is, thankfully, not a Freddy vs. Jason scenario, where narrative intrigue is thrown out of the window in favour of two cutout IPs tacked to a corkboard with the word fight between them. Instead, Duskmourn's designers take a foundation of references and disparate, often contradictory themes, and weave a specialist world to accommodate them. Let's start with the house, a rare rotational setting which is consistent across almost all horror media. Not just in the loose understanding that horror films tend to be set in and around houses, but more so that the house represents the environment of the horror, its literal home and its haunt. Both haunt in the spectral sense, such as with Poltergeist and Elm Street, but in a more metaphorical sense as well, such as how the cabins of Crystal Lake and the suburb of Haddonfield act as both the location of their respective terror's inception, as well as their point of return. Horror set in a house, be it one's own or an abandoned death trap, is a trope of horror media for good reasons, particularly film in the late 20th century. Houses are cheap sets in comparison to castles, cathedrals, and other traditional locales for spooky occurrences. As such, original horror flicks of this era, whose producers had to pay for soundstage time with shoestrings, would often use easy-to-access locations that required little in the way of additional funds to make ready for their stories. Whilst purse strings have loosened of late, with horror film budgets like Nope in the tens of millions, most horror movies were, and still are, shot on restricted budgets. As a point of comparison, 1980's Any Which Way You Can, the sequel to the decidedly mid Any Which Way But Loose starring Clint Eastwood and a monkey, had a budget of $15 million. That same year, Friday the 13th had a budget of just $550,000. Even if a director wanted to tell a horror story back then with a famous actor and an ape, they simply couldn't have afforded to. The cost of bananas alone would have bankrupted them. But new Hollywood horror requiring cheap locations, and houses being some of the cheapest, was far from a hindrance for the genre's atmosphere. The perversion of safety, a supposed bastion of personal security in the world turned into a site of physical and mental undoing, is evocative in a culture fundamentally guided by aspirations of acquiring personal property. The moral panics of the previous era turned American suspicions outwards. McCarthyism preached doom sermons of secret converted communists in your workplaces and neighbourhoods, reflected in horror media like Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1956 or The Literal Red Menace of the Blob 1958. Grand narratives of liberalism versus Bolshevism no longer drove the cultural superstructure as reliably as before, especially amid disillusionment with direct anti-communist intervention following America's defeat at the hands of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, coupled with the growing terror of a new, internal and biological threat in the form of the AIDS crisis. As the power of anti-communism as a cultural rallying point, if not a political one, faded along with the might of the USSR, and as the embryonic social democratic gains won by organised labour were liquidated by the Reagan administration, fractures began to appear in the newly assailable facade of America. This was all coupled with an explosion of consumer film technology and relaxing censorship law. A generation of filmmakers had been, as Kelly Roberts puts it in We Are the Mutants, surrendered control of the means of producing and manipulating the American image by legacy studios as a result. These creatives, many of whom were actively rebelling against the reactionary conservative politics and media they'd been raised on, responded by examining what lay below the cracks of a once stalwart hegemony. What they found was the slasher. Specifically as a product of a dysfunctional family, a symbol of the American narrative that was proving to be far from faultless, much as the rest of the system was too. Slashers as broken children from traumatized households, slashers as ghosts of hidden crimes committed by boring parents, slashers as the bloodthirsty scion of an otherwise regular family. Suddenly, the house was not only an accessible space to record film using new accessible technology, but an architectural metaphor for the false security of both the family and the social structure of the nation which birthed New Hollywood. All you could aspire to under neoliberalism was a privately owned plot to isolate yourself in, and as these directors sought to demonstrate, the call from the horror America was hiding from had been coming from inside the entire time. Houses also represent a narrow slither in the Venn diagram of settings common in late 20th century horror media and settings which are appropriate to canon magic's hyperreality. Whilst the skin-crawling liminality inherent in the structure of shopping malls was struck upon with Romero's critique of consumerism in Dawn of the Dead, and small-town USA has been turned inside out in flicks from Gremlins to It. In fact, just watch Stranger Things for the complete list of modern horror locales and tropes. It's not lazy if you sell it as irreverent. But the house, specifically the idea of the old creaking mansion, is the only space that could be explored with both modern sensibilities and the existing parameters of magic's hyperreality in mind without instigating absolute aversion in the audience. For all of the discourse surrounding Duskmourn's aesthetic clashing with the rest of the game and taking audiences out of the experience, I'd wager it to be a lot more of a lopsided debate if the designers had turned the entire world into a plane-spanning Westfields instead. The house, as well, is a variable thing. Whereas most of our lived spaces are a monoculture under liberalism, the mall is for shopping, the schools are for learning, the parks are for abandoning, etc., the house is presented as the core of individualism. You can play, learn, garden, cook, host, and sleep in a space which is aspirationally under your full control to change and improve to your single family's needs. Whilst this could lead into a conversation about how other societies have envisioned spaces beyond the house as multi-use and thus stimulated community in a way private home ownership alone could never do, suffice to say that lots of locations, objects, and themes can be included within the bounds of even a fantastical and infinitely large house without stressing the suspension of disbelief. For example, every room card printed in Duskmourn, a new mechanic for the set, could well exist within some eccentric mansion or attached to a quirky hotel. Even when the designers deign to move beyond the forest of rooms and present spaces like fairgrounds or cornfields, classic horror locales that even the most gaudy Yankee McMansion couldn't house, Duskmourn and our concept for the bounds of the house morphs to accommodate them. A house must have a garden, after all. Whilst a haunted house as big as the world isn't a consistent trope found in any mainstream horror of this era, it is employed here in order to provide a home to as much of this era as possible. Additionally, as any fan of horror can attest, actual supernatural horrors and spectres do not often mix with gremlins, who are rarely billed beside cultists, who don't frequently share green rooms with slashers, haunted dolls, and rejected concept art from Where the Wild Things Are. Yet all of these and more are frequent guests in contemporary horror narratives, and so a story must be weaved to encompass them all. One that, as we've already discussed, must also exist outside of the standard patterns of this set's inspirations in order to not shatter immersion. In this way, we could understand the horror of Duskmourn as consumerist occult. Returning to Thacker.
What has come to be called occult philosophy is really an amalgam of diverse intellectual traditions. Traditions that have, historically speaking, often been at odds with each other. In this mixing together of different speculative traditions, one finds Greek natural philosophy and cosmology, Neoplatonism, Renaissance alchemy, Egyptian hermetism, Christian scholastic theology, and Jewish mysticism.
In Duskmourn, just as the house expands to fill the entire plane, oppositional images of the developing horror genre in the late 20th century have been inversely collapsed together under the single umbrella of VHS-era horror. Whilst 1998's Ringu and 1984's The Devil's Gift are far from each other in tone, delivery, cultural significance, and message, in Duskmourn their references are literal collector number neighbours and links in the continuity of this world. Shout out to Dice Try for catching this one. In this sense, we could label Duskmourn as an expression of postmodern occultism, where rather than disparate historical epochs and traditions being blended together into a contradictory and homogeneous singularity, it is instead adversarial cultural commodities made to share space in a game world that is literally groaning at the seams with what it's seeking to contain. Some of the means by which disconnected art horror elements are incorporated here are expected. Returning to the fall of City in Children of the Carnival, some survivors of the house have developed Stockholm Syndrome and formed a cult which celebrates the enforced terror of Valgavoth as a cleansing ritual, one that purges fear from the multiverse and which promises that dedicated worshippers will enter a fearless paradise when, in reality, it is more than likely that they are just eaten by the demon when they've done all they can for him. monster is clearly evil but people worship it anyway is about as cliche as you could imagine for a cult in horror. Just as a side note, Stockholm Syndrome isn't a real thing. It was a term invented by a police psychiatrist to discredit the testimony of a hostage who criticised the cops for their botched response to a bank robbery and subsequent week-long standoff. Cops, generals, and journalists peddle it as quack science to simultaneously dismiss any criticism of law enforcement and to justify more bloody militarized responses to such situations, using the rhetoric of psychological warfare and of brainwashed converts to excuse the wanton slaughter of hostage and taker alike as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage in the pursuit of security and justice. I used the term before explicitly as an excuse to go on this educational tirade. There is a cop in your head and you need to destroy him. Anyway. Other inclusions of this era of horror in Duskmourn are more ingenious, such as with the ghosts and the notion of glitches. When Valgavoth pushed the walls of the house to the edges of planar reality, he occupied the space taken up by the material world, but also squeezed the immaterial world into a razor-thin halo, crushed between the true outside walls of the house and the blind eternities themselves. The boundaries of the house are unnatural and unstable, allowing for cracks where spirits seeking to flee their own post-life prison slip through. However, these gaps are narrow. The edges of doors that don't fit their frame, or cracks in the innumerable unusable TV screens which have replaced many of the world's windows. As a result, these ghosts arrive in reality physically and spiritually twisted, glitching out and malevolent, trapped in the moment of their death and haunting a space or activity which consumed them in life. Whilst the conclusion is a simple rip of countless haunting stories, a way to get both evil ghosts and VHS visuals into this 80s world, the working required to get there and how it flavours the eventual answer is unique. There's honestly a lot about Duskmourn which you could apply this same compliment to. Technology in general is another great example of a cliched conclusion being reached through interesting means. The time period Duskmourn's influences are set in is low-tech by today's standards, but the literal space age in comparison to the rest of the multiverse. Sure, Kamigawa is rocking cyberpunk of late, but the tech behind that is anchored to the spiritual realm of the plane itself. Similarly with Kaladesh, whilst many of the mechanical innovations would usher in an age of untold prosperity for most planes, they're powered by Aether, which is uniquely prevalent and accessible on Kaladesh itself. A game whose managers are interested in letting their creatives tell complex stories may have deigned to explore the idea of multiplanar collaboration and conflict surrounding the proliferation of this kind of technology, but I'll settle for Videlcan cameos and settler colonialism instead, I guess. So, as a designer, you want to create a world of CRT TV screens, Fisher-Price toys, and general Ghostbuster shit, but need to explain why any of this tech was created in a pure horror world, and why it is that no planeswalker in history has ever been seen rocking Air Jordans up until now. The solution reached was to include these artifacts, but to render them less than useful, as mere relics of a lost civilization, their inner workings riddled by demonic meddling, and their cultural significance dissolved over generations of hardship. Look to how Dawn is tinkering with some sort of kitchen implement, boxy and rectangular, with 2 slots in the top and a heating coil inside, in Children of the Carnival Part 2. She is turning what we recognise as a toaster into a weapon to dispatch ghosts, its original use beyond the scope of imagination, now cannibalised to fight against monsters which exist due to that past society's actions. This is, if I may be frank and subjective for a moment, a righteous fucking move. This technology exists in a horror space because this technology, which Valgavoth was first trapped to power, created this horror space. It's honestly really slick, and the implications, both narrative and metaphorical, it creates rule. Tyvar wields a baseball bat with Home Depot basic nails in it because once there was a sport similar to baseball here, but whose memory has faded beyond recovery. In a way, this and similar images become metaphors for the audience's engagement with Duskmourn itself. Objects whose original meaning has been washed out after generations of derivative filmmaking, now wielded several times removed from its original purpose and symbology. Duskmourn is at its best when it is like this. reveling in its own hauntological buffet of tropes, placing them in a haunted house thrill ride which acknowledges and builds on its own sense of reflecting a long dead world and time. It is in moments like this that Duskmourn feels like it's trying to say something about the emptiness of repetition, the vicious cycle of a hollowing culture which fuels and is created by endless remakes, parodies and pastiches rather than original creations. Duskmourn is the ghost of a cultural past which we are unwilling and increasingly unable to think beyond. And which is why, when that self-awareness decays from criticism into parody, it's all the more disappointing. The line can be blurry at times. On first blush, Orphans of the Wheat is a groan-worthy riff on Children of the Corn, but the glowing eyes and haunting coordination of the children here are far closer to texts like The Midwich Cuckoos and its film adaptations like Village of the Damned. Much is the same with Say Its Name, a synthesis of the many spirits that are summoned by repeating their name: Bloody Mary, Candyman, Beetlejuice, and the purposefully unnamed spirit of Algonquian folklore. I will say that Alternax, the being summoned through this card, being an insect beast rather than a spirit, is a confusing decision for me. As of all of the planes to summon a ghost through a mirror, Duskmourn would surely be the one, but this monstrous, abstract ant scorpion is still quite the sight. Closer to the grain, Unsettling Twins and Friendly Ghost are clear references to The Shining and Casper respectively, with little in the way of additional meaning. To me, their existence leans far more into the idea of Duskmourn as a gaudy fairground ride decal brought to life. You know, the ones which turn up twice a year in a nearby park whose scrambler cars inexplicably have both Pinhead and the Hulk's face emblazoned upon them. Art and people reduced to often unflattering paintings meant to gesture towards recognisable association with thrills. Baudrillard would weep to behold them. The one that comes to my local park has Freddy Krueger decals on top of its waltzers, but the artist decided one of them ought to be that scene from Dream Warriors where Freddy pretends to be a seductive nurse, so occasionally you'll look up from your cotton candy to see Robert Englund's face on top of a naked woman's body staring down at you. This tangent adds nothing to my analysis of Duskmourn, I just think it's fucking bizarre and I needed to tell some strangers. Cards like these, or Comeback Wrong's not so subtle allusion to the Evil Dead, feed into Duskmourn's atmosphere as the final resting place of a dead culture's once cherished artifacts, like old DVDs of award-winning movies gathering mildew in a basement. More egregious are images like Acrobatic Cheerleader, which transform what at times can be read as an interesting meditation on our modern drive to resurrect estranged icons from the graveyard of culture into a light-hearted gallery of wink and nudge gags. It makes no sense within the context of the world, a place where people have almost forgotten the concept of cities, for someone to know about cheerleading, let alone ape their costuming and actions in amongst fighting for survival. But cheerleaders and high school age girls of any sexualized vocation, which could frankly be anything, are one of the many targets for a slasher's violence, so they must be included somewhere and somehow. The employment of subtlety could have saved this card and many others from frustrating the interesting elements of this set. By not explicitly referring to this character as a cheerleader, by not giving her self-aware flavor text, but still showing her in the costume and flipping over monsters as she may have done in a previous life, the tone of her existence would be totally changed. Now, rather than checking a box on a list of reoccurring characters, she is instead a metaphor for our own insistence on resurrecting the cheerleader from film to film, only to see her slain again and again. She wields the pom-poms of a long-dead reality, though she cannot say why, does not know the vocation she is performing a role as, yet does so anyway, trapped in endlessly repeating story beats in the same way her character is trapped in this house. I also want to say that the previous analysis was written in late August, when only the name of the cheerleader card had been revealed, and has remained unchanged since. I hope that the fact that my criticisms based solely on assumption turned out to be accurate to this card's reality demonstrates the abject predictability of much of Magic's design of late. My only incorrect guess was that she'd have pom-poms in her artwork, which would at least have elevated this card into the realm of high camp and recuperated some of its value. I also want to make it clear that my disdain for this predictability, coupled with inconsistency between game object and world building, should not be read as contempt for the individual designers, writers, or artists of Magic. More so for the continued lack of communication between departments, most likely being the fault of management and the shareholder demands they themselves are bound to enact. When you're tasked to name and write flavour for a card and you're given next to no information about the wider world you're trying to contribute to, naturally you'll end up creating safe prose that slots in with what little guidance you have been given and just hope it doesn't break something you're not aware of. This issue has been acute in Magic for years, from the multiple story spotlight cards in War of the Spark which depict events never included in the story, to how the cards in Ikoria present Luca as a friend to the Plains Beasts when, in the plot, he sees them only as tools to weaponize against the people who wronged him. Things have improved ever since Magic returned to its story article model, but still, each set has me begging that the people who make Magic's worlds be given space, tools, and time to confer with each other in order to realise their visions more consistently. It is the varied worlds which creatives develop that set this game apart from its contemporaries, and it is a shame when their most interesting plot elements, such as the desperate double apocalypse faced by the survivors of Duskmourn in response to the Omen Paths, fails to be conveyed on any cardstock. As another example, Undead Sprinter's flavor text specifically represents two entirely separate ideas for what Duskmourn is fighting with one another. Farley had always been the fastest on the track team, but no one was cheering anymore. What track team? Unless this is a centuries-old zombie whose erstwhile teammates are lost to time, this flavour contradicts the essence of this set's world-building, and if it doesn't, if there is a pocket of Duskmourn so unbothered by this hellish reality that a school and associated track team have developed, then this absolutely saps the impact of stories like Dead End. The quiet, stomach-dropping horror of the last element of the world to be devoured by the house being its lonely, unobserved son loses a lot of its edge when you picture the elves of Rotru then stumbling upon a perfectly normal after-school chess club.
By entering this room, you hit a tripwire that has already called the police.
To be fair, now that I'm mulling it over, the idea of survivors clinging onto elements from their past with frothing reverence, maintaining high school track and field events despite the horrors, generations of survival transforming them into bizarre rituals and warped reflections of the activities of a forgotten world, elders forcing teenagers to compete in ever more grueling athletic challenges, making them run laps around bottomless pits, a metaphor for how parents of that era and even still today manipulate kids into injuring themselves physically and emotionally in projected aspirations of a supremacist ideal of bodily perfection and the wealth and power it brings to a lucky, sculpted few under capitalism. That sounds like a cool idea. But a post-it note reading, "High schoolers get killed in horror films, so reference high school where you can," is a fine alternative pitch, I guess. Oy. As long as we're here clearing things up, there's been a lot of noise made about Duskmourn's aesthetic jarring with Magic as a whole. Whilst I don't disagree that these elements fail to pair well with Ice Queen wizards and rodent rogues, I hope the previous analysis has laid clear when, for me, this contrast has been granted greater meaning with a knowingly postmodern approach, and also when it hasn't, and thus falls flat. Returning to Tyvar wielding a baseball bat is a card in this set, and it shouldn't be, or at least not called that. In the world where Duskmourn's designers have been able to embrace these meta-narratives, this would have been called Forgotten Game Club or Antique Sports Stick. We know what this is, but our characters don't, in the same way as many Magic players would be hard-pushed to explain why a baseball bat over similar blunt tools has attained prestige as a modern anti-monster implement. I think that technology and artifacts representative of our own world aren't bad additions to the game, so long as something interesting is done regarding their implementation. This is why I have few qualms with the UFO grey alien stuff in this set. Not only are extraterrestrials a repeated element of horror throughout this period, from Invasion of the Body Snatchers to Alien to Fire in the Sky, But also these ethereal illusions are pulling double service, soft launching the upcoming exploration of outer space as a setting for canon magic. If you're going to experiment with expanding the boundaries of the worlds magic can explore, it's actually a good idea to stick reasonably unobtrusive toes in the water first to establish expectations. The environment of Duskmourn adds a facade of deniability here as well. Is the unidentified hovership, great name by the way, an actual visitor from the stars, as was the Fomori Vault from Thunder Junction? Or is it, like its nightmare counterpart, a trick of the house? The fear of a past encounter from a survivor's mind made manifest. Either way, there is value to its inclusion, but the fact that its materiality is unclear is deeply fitting for the realm that we are slinging cards in. But what about the cards of Duskmourn? Much as I revel in getting into the weeds of storytelling, we can't talk about a game without discussing its actual game objects. To begin with mechanical themes, there are two major ones, enchantments and the graveyard. The former is embodied in the new Glimmer creatures alongside the nightmares, the new room type, and the eerie mechanic, a strict upgrade to Theros' constellation which triggers on both enchantments entering under your control and rooms unlocking. On rooms, there's no better place to say this, but this mechanic is a great and simple synthesis in the design of this game. What if you mixed the incremental addition of benefits and complexity seen in class cards with the modular utility of split cards? Well, you get an enchantment where you cast one half of it for an effect and activate or open the other half of it later on when you need. It's a new card type that neither breaks a format nor forces you to wrangle your head around a pamphlet of new rules, and it does so whilst being very aesthetically pleasing. There was a time when the room mechanic had you moving a meeple on a separate board next to the battlefield, a la Betrayal at House on the Hill, and I'm infinitely thankful that we got this streamlined card type instead. Good job, designers. Or should I say, architects. Why are there several laser dots pointing at my chest right now? The other big theme is the graveyard, a zone whose inherent spookiness causes it to be the focus of all horror-themed products within this game. The graveyard is filled with mechanics like Manifest Dread, where you manifest one of the top two cards of your library as a face-down 2/2 creature and put the other into the graveyard. As the graveyard grows bigger, it may trigger Delirium. Like Threshold, this mechanic requires a specific number of things to be in your graveyard to proc, but asks for 4 different card types rather than 7 cards in total. Pro gamers will, of course, note that Delirium is far easier to pull off in Duskmourn in comparison to its original haunt, Shadows over Innistrad, due to the increased existence of enchantment and artifact creatures in this set, with glimmers, nightmares, toys, scarecrows, and horrors. It's easy to get instants and sorceries in your yard on purpose, and as the game goes on, creatures will, more often than not, end up there too. But in Shadows Limited, without lucky self-mill or tactical discards, it took quite the effort to get that all-important 4th card type into the bin. People were really pitching card advantage engines to sinister concoction in draft just so that their 6/6 for 6 could have trample. Life was tough back then. And god damn it, we liked it that way! In Duskmourn, however, Delirium can be ready to go as early as your 2nd turn. Play and crack Terramorphic Expanse on turn 1, cast Grab the Prize and pitch Clockwork Percussionist on turn 2. And congratulations, your turn 3 Little Shop of Horrors stand-in is now completely disgusting, and if you ever play that line against me in Sealed, I hope you pray to a vengeful god. On that note, if there's one more meta theme to be taken here, it's that Duskmourn is an even more intense environment for horror than Innistrad. Delirium is easier to pull off. Impending now brings horrors even closer to reality than Suspend. Even Manifest is tinged with the scent of the tomb. Original Innistrad showcased how black mana was more potent on the plane, printing a powerful mono-black planeswalker, a to-this-day banned-in Commander legendary demon, and even subtle things like giving black its first 2/2 for 2 mana without drawbacks. Duskmourn 2 gives us a series of very powerful black cards as well as those subtle upgrades, such as how Withering Torment compares to Feed the Swarm, and how Bone Splinters only destroys whereas Final Vengeance exiles. Power creep absolutely needs to be acknowledged, but it is still clear that black mana in Duskmourn is to Innistrad what Innistrad's black mana was to the rest of the multiverse. There is a final mechanic, however, which paradoxically fits in the story of this world in how it doesn't fit with the other mechanics: survival. Whilst the graveyard and enchantments are both realms beyond the scope of the survivors in this world, the former being the playground of killers and monsters, the latter being the realm of spirits and nightmares, humanity instead focuses on small, temporary wins, namely not dying. Whilst on its surface, survival seems to be just a delayed benefit granted to creatures who did something in combat, triggering on creatures who begin your second main phase tapped, it's a lot more nuanced than this. First off, of course, it doesn't require your creature to enter combat at all. If you cast the Wandering Rescuer by convoking your survivors, they will gain their survival ability provided you did so before your combat phase ended. Additionally, if you do attack with your survivors, they need only do that: survive. Whether they deal combat damage to a player or even if they defeat the monster blocking them is irrelevant. All that matters for this mechanic, all that matters for the survivors of Duskmourn, is snatching an extra day of life from the oppressive dark. I adore the survive mechanic as a representation of the desperate reality these characters inhabit. How that atomizes them, and as we can see in the characters of Winter and City in the main story, leads them to becoming myopic misanthropes. Sure, when me and my 4 friends faced evil, they all perished, but so long as I keep slipping under the monster's gaze, I'll keep tagging along with new groups. So, taken in whole, the mechanics of Duskmourn demonstrate 3 realities: the narrow world in which the survivors continue to chase tomorrow, the world of phantasms and horrors, and the world of the dead, either that of reanimated corpses or those who add bodies to the pile. These are also the 3 worlds explored by horror media, with one or the other of either material death, slashers and zombies, or spiritual destruction, ghosts and demons, proving the narrow boundaries of human survival and contracting them until the film's final act. But broad themes are created by individual cards, many of which do a lot of heavy lifting in the atmosphere department, and I really want to talk about some of them in detail. Cynical Loner and Fear of the Dark are niche pieces, designed, I imagine, with limited play in mind first and foremost, but which also do a great job of placing the narrative role of the Glimmers into the context of gameplay. The former demonstrates the normal place Glimmers hold in this world in how this loner, this outside of the norm, rejects them, turning her back on them in the artwork and also not being able to be blocked by them, showing through mechanical and narrative rejection that Glimmers usually exist to provide aid and companionship to survivors. It would take a particularly staunch cynic to refuse their aid, yet there is nuance here. Whilst this character may dismiss Glimmers, she does so still as a survivor, with both the type and associated mechanic. The rules of Duskmourn are thus muddied and displayed in welcome shades of grey, in showing that it's possible to not welcome these apparitions while still being included in the ranks of the world's quote-unquote good guys. A small yet great step is taken in creating a sense of depth and texture in Duskmourn. It is somewhat undercut by a card like Popular Egoist, however, who sacrifices other creatures so she may live. In my opinion, this card should have absolutely been a survivor with the survival mechanic. Not only would her activated ability proc survival, but it'd also go a ways to sell the cutthroat reality of survival in Duskmourn. Sure, this prep bully stand-in is surviving at the cost of another person's life, but she is still surviving. Returning to Glimmers, Fear of the Dark demonstrates their oppositional relationship with the house. Whilst Glimmers and Nightmares are both born of the house, the former is manifested by hope and the latter by fear. Fear of the Dark being a 5/5 for 5 that only gets stronger when your opponent controls no glimmers, i.e. no light, shows that whilst glimmers are useful tools for the survivors to hold on to, the nightmares of this house are still formidable and only get scarier when you're without your legally distinct Patronus. The deck is demonstrably stacked in the house's favour. Dashing Bloodsucker is another card I love, mainly for its artwork. It drips 80s chic and oozes camp horror in a masterful way. The lifted sunglasses revealing blood-red eyes posed in a cheeky wink, the playful grin revealing demure cat-like fangs under a pencil-thin moustache, part Eddie Murphy, part Vincent Price. It evokes the vampirism as a lifestyle choice, not a curse, that films like The Lost Boys toyed with. The jagged 2-track cut through this character's fade left ambiguous as to if it is fashion or the result of an attack in the house. The split in the wall behind this figure exposing teeth and gums where insulation or a crawl space should be, reminding us viewing this piece that for all of the momentary fun of this wink and that of the creature flicks we so fondly remember, abject hell exists only a few feet away. As the flavor text reminds us, there are worse things here than vampires. A subtle nod to how this entire era of horror embraced loosening censorship and improving special effects to produce terrors that made Bela Lugosi's tenure as Count Dracula seem quaint and dated in comparison.
God, I love talking about this game! Woo!
Also, because this set contains multitudes, Duskmourn gives me the opportunity to discuss references which work and those which don't, or at least which grind rather than nod, with multiple references to the same past horror titles. Let's Play a Game is a card whose name and mechanics reflect the many irony-soaked death traps and non-choices of the Saw franchise. However, that series stands apart from the majority of the rest of the set's influences. These gritty, abjectly unspiritual torture flicks are very much a post-millennium, post-Scream trend. Even the most grounded killers of the 70s through to the 90s, such as Michael Myers, always had a touch of the supernatural about them, which would usually develop into full-blown mystical backstories and incursions later in the series. Compare the implied existence of a resurrected child at the end of the first Friday the 13th with the outright confirmation of an Abrahamic hell in the 10th film of the franchise's 12 movies. Wait, they made 12 Friday the 13th films? 12? As the 80s gave way to the 90s, many of the slasher series which were still producing sequels would take great steps to tone down their supernatural connections. The cult elements of Michael Myers, for example, were thrice retconned, most recently in the promising, then rapidly disappointing Halloween 2018 trilogy, but also even earlier, with both Rob Zombie's take on the story and with the franchise's first millennium-adjacent film, Halloween H2O. Not to be mistaken with H2O Just Add Water's Halloween special. Me and the kids at my sister's sleepover birthday learnt that the hard way. A line does exist, as blurry as it is, between 80s film series like A Nightmare on Elm Street and post-millennial franchises like Saw. This is not to say that godless horror like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and spiritual chillers like Hereditary don't exist in these different epochs. More so that Saw's heavily felt influence on this world, a supposed send-up of a different era of horror, is as jarring as it would be for the next film in the series to reveal that John Kramer has, in fact, been granted eternal life by the devil from the Bible. However, this card is not the only reference to the Saw films. The uncommon equipment saw is both literally a rusty circular saw, but also a reference, both in the naked simplicity of its name and also in the way that those who wield it can sacrifice parts of their board, read body, to draw cards, read gain Kramerist enlightenment. For me, it's the more deniable ambiguity that makes this a successful nod, whereas Let's Play a Game is more droll. Duskmourn being in large part a set about the horror media that grew out of the tales which inspired Innistrad, can't help but to acknowledge a wide range of horror tropes and artifacts, as is the case with the subgenre nod of found footage or the X-Files allegory Phenomenon Investigators, whose mechanics let you either believe or doubt, and whose name falls into the Inspector Spacetime realm of unambiguous parody. Those artifacts may not gel aesthetically or tonally with the world you're trying to build. As such, gestures towards a particular cultural touchstone without straying either too far from your core aesthetic or being too abrasive in their signposting lets you play with ideas beyond the scope of the world without reminding the audience of the patchwork hyperreality that they're trying to enjoy. For example, look at how Innistrad referenced the Fly in Delver of Secrets, where a researcher's hubris leads him to transform himself into an insectile aberration. It's iconic, yet understated. A knowing nod for those aware of modern horror tales, but not pushing too hard against the gothic boundaries of the rest of the world. Now we can look at Midnight Hunt's reprint of this card, where a human scientist enters an almost identical pod to the one we see in Cronenberg's version of The Fly, only to this time be overjoyed at his transformation, the bug he swapped heads with a la Newman's 1958 film of the same name, flitting out beside him. The former captures the feeling of the fly whilst not jeopardising the aesthetic continuity of the world. The latter captures what the fly looks like in our cultural memory, but does so without delivering the core feeling of the story and whilst contributing to the increasing steampunkification of Innistrad. It is entirely possible to reference existing media, but doing so too bluntly will only serve to rattle your audience's immersion. Also, I really need to make that Innistrad video. I feel like I've made a lot of criticisms of referential cards without pointing to an isolated one that I do like. So here I want to bring up Haunted Screen, a mana rock which first generates black and white mana, but which goes on to make red, blue or green mana with a bit of extra investment, and which also becomes a late game threat after 7 mana is pumped into it. Not only do we have an allusion to the ring with a 7/7 spirit pulled from the TV for 7 mana following Samara's 7-day phone call and subsequent CRT teleportation, but also there's a nod to the development of television technology, from black and white imaging to the more expensive RGB technology which outsold its monochrome forebearer in the 1970s. This works as a card, it works as a bundled group of inspired images, and it does so not by pulling you out of the set, but by developing its internal themes. I like this. I also want to talk about the lurking horror cards. Whilst most of Magic's special and alt art treatments of cards have been reserved for shiny collectibles or secret lair tie-ins of late, these in-set, in-border alternative arts are the exact kind of thing that resources and time should be spent creating. Stay Hidden, Stay Silent in particular is gripping for me. In its base art, we see a survivor cowering behind a sofa, hand over his mouth, staring at the edge of his hiding place for a sign of a monster we have yet to see. The space at the top of the frame is devoid of features, except for that of an open doorway to which our eyes naturally move. If this were a film, we would stare at it, waiting for a shadow to shift, but like any good horror movie, the lurking horror art subverts our expectations. The gangly beast is already in the room, well past the doorway and milliseconds from snatching their prey. The survivor's eyeline is recontextualized here, now staring at the second hand grasping over the edge of the sofa, his covered mouth, his final attempt to avoid the awareness of a horror that he does not yet know has already found him. The set has a great variety of these treatments. From almost invisible additions like the ghoul at the top of Norrin Swift's Survivalist's frame, a perfect character choice for an Omen Path cameo in this world, by the way, to more, shall we say, sharp changes seen between versions of Reluctant Role Model. There's something about pinpoint white eyes and a mass of shadows which just gives me the willies. The range of different levels of obtrusiveness to these jump scares is a great element of these treatments. One that I'm certain will cause many unnerved moments in LGSs when packs are opened and startled murmurings flutter from tables as unexpected faces leer from previously empty corners of artwork, or where players think they see a monster in the background of artwork that wasn't there before, only to realise it was just a mark on their card sleeve, or a trick of the light. These treatments are a genius element of this set, and I'm purposefully showing as few of them as I can, both for your own surprise and my own. To me, however, none stand out better than the monster in Stay Hidden, Stay Silent. Even if it does remind me of Jeremy from Smiling Friends.
Dude, if you do that again, I'm gonna punch you, I'm not kidding.
Horror is generally a fraught concept for Magic to navigate due to its nature as a 13+ rated card game. I've already made a video about horror board games and the difficulty such media faces in provoking the same responses that other media, film and video games for example, manage with ease. The conveying of horror in this set is a mixed bag, neither wholly successful nor entirely poor, which makes it fucking nectar for the parasites that are YouTube video essayists. To begin with the good, horror is all about implication. There is a twisted relief when a death occurs in horror media, the full inversion of a joke's punchline, as Noel Carrol writes in The Philosophy of Horror.
Suspense in fiction in general is generated by combining elements of morality and probability in such a way that the questions that issue in the plot have logically opposed answers. X will happen, X will not happen. And furthermore, that opposition is also characterized by an opposition of morality and probability ratings. Monsters generally have the upper hand in horror fictions. In most cases, there would be no point to the fiction if they did not. Consequently, when monsters are encountered by humans, the situation is ripe for suspense, for the monster's minatory motives have the best chances of success.
Like laughter at the end of a gag, suspense in horror is rewarded, if that's the right word, with usually the gruesome end of a victim or the infrequent, often final triumphant defeat of the monster at the hands of our human protagonist. Suspense lies in the question of what will happen, and relief is found in the answer, whichever way it shakes out. But magic cannot present the kind of conclusions that horror media is famous for. We cannot see a screaming woman stabbed onto a meat hook and made to watch her boyfriend be dismembered in magic. Not that we would even want that. This is not to say that gory violence doesn't exist in the art of this game. One need only look at grisly spectacle, the metacarpal compound fractures of deflecting palm, or even dismember itself to be proved otherwise. But still, there is a difference between an almost comically framed and relatively sans viscera decapitation, a surprisingly bloodless martial art hand explosion, or violence enacted on a fictional non-human figure, and the real-time, graphic, and realistic violence found in most horror media. The Wandering Rescuer can, for example, slice a purple-blooded monster in half and be teen-friendly in a way that simply does not translate if that same monster were to slice open her stomach. Of course, as we've discussed in the section on Duskmourn's story, brutal violence is a definite part of this world, but what you can get away with in the written word can't be replicated in visual depictions without coming into conflict with those age ratings a lot sooner. Thus, magic has a restriction in what it can show happening, which ends up being a boon for developing suspense across its artwork. In being unable to show the answers to the questions of monsters' attacks, the art provokes our imaginations as to what the likely outcome will be. The game cannot show us Razorkin Needlehead ripping a bespeckled survivor into pieces, and so instead displays the reflection of its charge in its victim's glasses, a bulging eyeball and screaming mouth mere centimetres away from the points of the slasher's talons, and lets our imagination theorise the rest. Like all horror media, we're only really scared in the build-up to a violent altercation. We clutch pillows over our eyes, not when the killer claims a victim, but more often as the background music cuts out, and as the protagonist cluelessly wanders around their empty house. In Duskmourn, there are an abundance of cruel fates which befall the survivors of the house. They are harried by eyeballs, sliced by bastards, consumed by darkness, transformed into monstrosity, possessed by ghouls, snatched by horrors, exploded by mouths, wounded in magic circles, maddened by bugs, devoured by flames, and much, much more. Whilst there is a lot of peril, the classic concept of a kill count can't exist on Duskmourn. The age rating wouldn't allow for it. Violence needs to be magical, abstract, bloodless, comedic, or implied, much as it was in the earliest examples of this new form of horror film. Movie censorship, whilst beginning to wane, was still rife in the 70s and 80s, especially in the UK, where the hag Thacker banned so-called video nasties, denying them to many a budding filmmaker's gaze. Moves which, in retrospect, seem laughable. What, we're gonna criminalise watching fictional violence, but legalise paramilitary death squads whilst driving millions of adults and children into starvation levels of poverty? Say what you will about conservatism, but at least it's consistent through the ages. As well, the idea that these films were once considered to be too scary for even exclusively adult audiences is cute after decades of subsequent desensitisation. Despite its violence being confrontational for the time, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reads as pedestrian as far as gore is concerned compared with the splatterfest that would go on to develop in Hollywood. Similarly, the idea that Magic at one time had to censor the word demon from its cardstock due to evangelical pearl clutching is quaint when looking at Duskmourn's vile mutilator, seen here about to crush the Lamb of God in its satanic claws. No better example for the changing tension in this era of horror exists than the fact that the Museum of Modern Art in New York bought the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the same year as the nation of Sweden banned it. But while limits have expanded, the creators of Duskmourn 2, like the film studios of the 80s desperate to avoid an X rating, are working within narrow confines in order to convey horror and transmit fear. In a very meta way, the fact that Duskmourn has a 13+ rating attached to it means that the images it can show, the themes it can explore, almost even the language that it can use, is remarkably similar to the early days of the very era it's based on. Of course, however, it cannot be dismissed that even the earliest horror flicks of this era had moments of bombastic gore which are a far cry from every piece of art in this set. Whilst the anticipation of demise is the forgotten majority of horror's emotional foundation, those payoffs do need to exist and they do need to justify our continued terror. If Mrs. Voorhees hit the counsellors of Crystal Lake in the head with a hammer to kill them or zapped them with a spell, her slow encircling of Alice wouldn't have had as much tension as it did. That tension existed in no small part because we'd seen her pierce Kevin Bacon's trachea with a hunting arrow. From behind. Through his fucking spine. Returning to Carter Hager and Maguire's interviews, gore was limited in art by decree and in text by censor. Maguire speaks of violence in terms of what she could get away with, whereas Carter Hager went into design with quote-unquote no blood as the first restriction of what Duskmourn's art would contain. These restrictions also included no harm to children and survivors shown to have agency. I've gone back and forth on this point as to whether or not these restrictions, particularly that of no blood, is a good or bad decision, and I've since reached the cop-out conclusion that it's both. Short horror media, particularly those released on platforms like YouTube, such as The Other Side of the Box, Portrait of God, Lights Out, and the vast majority of analog horror contributions, which we'll get onto later, don't use gore. Putting aside the content limitations of these platforms, the implication of violence in the build-up to one final devastating scare is more than enough for the run length of these pieces. Understanding Duskmourn's cards as similar vignettes, micro-narratives of horror, plays into the strengths of similar short media. However, as we are repeatedly told, Duskmourn is a send-up of the 80s and surrounding decades, and I can assure you that this era was not one for subtlety and reservations. Filmmakers railed against the limits they were forced to contend with, giving us scenes from films like The Exorcist, which I cannot describe on YouTube without guaranteeing demonetization. Gore wasn't always just a cheap thrill, either. It was also a realm of extraordinary visual experimentation, such as the to this day remarkable reanimation scene from Hellraiser. Shorts are also not bereft of gore. Curve is a short, suspenseful vision of some alien limbo where the bloody hands of our nameless protagonist are a vital image and key plot element for the narrative. Explorations of violence and anatomic terror begat, pardon the pun, dissections of our own understanding of our bodies. It helps us question previously held sacred ground and deconstruct generational myths in ways only possible through violence, artistic or otherwise. As such, whilst Duskmourn doesn't fail in generating a horror atmosphere playing into the strengths of its medium, it doesn't capture the era it seeks to due to the limitations in its artwork, both from direction and from age ratings. The age-gated limitations also mean that faithful and studied send-ups of horror media's conventions and themes become fraught, if not impossible. In the late August PAX panel, which kicked off preview season for this set, we were told that our crew of 5 heroic characters exploring this world were supposed to fit into the classic roles of horror films. Tyvar is the jock, Zimone is the nerd, the Wanderer is the final girl, but then things took a turn. Kato is the grizzled warrior, a character that does sometimes appear in horror media, but usually as a secondary character to be killed off after failing to confront the monsters. The comic failure of the would-be woodsman from the Red Riding Hood parable is a repeated theme in 80s slasher films. Nico gets the most confusing role, the leader, a changeable position almost always first adopted by the jock and then by the final girl after he is slain. Of course, the actual core group of classic horror flicks can't be explored in Magic. The stoner, The comic relief character who often survives other characters only to die in order to signal the coming of the bloody conclusion can't be here for obvious drug-related reasons. The promiscuous blonde too can't be included. Her role is to satiate misogyny as entertainment, the desecration of female beauty as deemed necessary and thrilling by a cavalcade of straight cis male creatives.
Cinema hardly invented the pattern. It has simply given visual expression to the abiding proposition that, in Poe's famous formulation, the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world. As slasher director Dario Argento puts it, I like women, especially beautiful ones. If they have a good face and figure, I would much prefer to watch them being murdered than an ugly girl or a man.
Whilst I wouldn't want to know who Wizards would select as the quote-unquote bimbo for this set, in being unable to explore these more adult and criminal elements, we are also denied the opportunity to deconstruct and subvert them. Instead, we are granted a sanitization of the authentic. The elements of this era that break the PG-13 rating and other parts considered socially archaic are tossed aside, whilst the product insists on maintaining the surface-level aesthetic, a simulacra of a simulacra. Here is where Magic again stumbles into the problem with postmodern design. In trying to have your cake and eat it, in wanting to do an 80s flick with only the stuff that stands up 40 years later, you create a halfway thing. A series of images that neither accurately portrays what you're seeking to reference, but also which fail to say anything new. The Wanderer, for example, represents the final girl in as far as she is a woman who can kill monsters. But this is a reductive understanding that leaves zero room for constructive depictions of what a final girl could look like in modern horror. If the Wanderer is to represent the final girl, putting aside her established combat skills, she lacks many of the other elements that would allow her to do so. She is not the focus of the killer. Hers is not the blow which slays the monster. She goes through an arc throughout the story, but it has very little to do with the setting, let alone Valgavoth, and maybe most importantly, at no point in the story is she ever alone. You can't be a final girl if everyone you started the story with is safe and sound by the time the credits roll. The final girl trope has persisted in contemporary horror cinema, with flicks like Ready or Not, Freaky, Midsummer, and It Follows, each presenting interesting development and criticism of the image. However, understanding the Wanderer to embody the role here demonstrates an incorrect tendency to remember the concept as always having been a breakout feminist symbol. Tony Williams points out how every original final girl either becomes the victim for one final scare or is saved by a male parental figure or her lover, and this only really changed in the late 80s due to shifting perspectives on the presumed inherent sanctity of male authority figures, as he details.
This era saw a growing revelation of cases of child abuse and dysfunctional families, giving the lie to the Reagan family dream. At the same time, the developing Iran and Contragate revelations showed that father did not know best, but that, like a doddering grandfather, he was not even aware of what was going on in the White House. Later versions of the Friday the 13th, Halloween, and Nightmare on Elm Street films emphasized the role of dysfunctional families, showing the necessity of constant vigilance against supernatural patriarchal avatars and their real-life dysfunctional counterparts. It is the latter factor that distinguishes the real survival of the final girl in these films. These final girls differ in every film as a result of relevant historical, not discursively theoretical, factors.
There is a line between what Harry Benshoff calls co-opted or commercialized postmodernism and utopian or deconstructive postmodernism. Co-opted postmodernism more regularly and more cynically recycles images from previous eras without critical stances, a postmodernism of naive nostalgia and cultural exhaustion. Conversely, utopian postmodernism is far more of a radical practice, moving away from binary oppositions, theorizing queerness, and celebrating the Krachtinian carnivalesque, embracing destabilized social structures in media as a call or even a tool for the destabilization of social structures in reality. If the Wanderer is the final girl, let us bear in mind that none of the texts of the story or cards confirm this connection. This was just announced during a PAX panel as something kept in mind during world design, but if she is, her presentation falls into this first category, in not even touching the edges of decades of final girls in film, in not even replicating tropes, let alone subverting them, in effect, being final girl in label alone. We can only read this as cynical. As an example of the utopian postmodernism with mild spoilers, I have to once again uphold Bury Your Gaze, a text aware of its general and queer genre conventions to a point where its brilliant conclusion is directly tied to issues of representation in film writing. Lieberman is correct that the queerest stories are the hardest to write, but heavens are they worth the toil. An inland ocean of ink has been spilt on the interconnectedness of sexuality, particularly queer sexuality, and horror. From the aforementioned Freddy's Revenge to the sexual politics of Fright Night 1985, where neighbourhood vampires disguise their otherness by cosplaying as flamboyant antique dealers, feeding on both women and men in intimate displays of occult erotica. We would also be remiss in not acknowledging Clive Barker's unambiguous hyper-exaggeration of the sadomasochism he encountered in Britain's gay scenes in the Hellraiser films. Certainly, this set seeks to recall it. Sex and sexuality is a touchstone for horror media, and queerness is always explored, most often in either monstrosity or victimhood. To quote Vito Russo,
"The essence of homosexuality as a predatory weakness permeates the depiction of gay characters in horror films." Oh, and while I was setting up to record this, I hit the record button and then got up and immediately tripped over a bag of props next to my desk and smashed into the desk, and my coffee went everywhere. It's really embarrassing and my knee hurts.
There is a complexity at the heart of queerness in horror. Whilst many, myself included, relish in identifying with and celebrating the otherness of the monster in its conflict with suburban wasp normality, it is undeniable that otherness is rarely presented as positively deconstructed, more often as dangerous and threatening, an attitude that slips into reality. It was common to see headlines such as "Gay Vampire Catches AIDS" and "AIDS-Wary Vampires Pull in Their Fangs" at the onset of the AIDS epidemic. Trans existence has also often been broadcast as synonymous with the infernal. The 1953 Glenn or Glenda, I Changed My Sex documentary that Vito Russo analyses in the Celluloid Closet follows Glenda's transition, but is narrated by Bela Lugosi.
Man's constant groping of things unknown.
The promotional material spares no disambiguation with the connotation it seeks to draw, displaying Lugosi in full Count costume, looming behind the two heads of Glenda before and after transitioning, hands clawed downwards as if puppeteering them. Flashing forward to the era which Duskmourn seeks to emulate and even further to today, we can see how only some perspectives have changed of both queer and trans people in the West, particularly the latter. Rhetoric from the religious right, who are increasingly labelling even commodified and corporate pride merchandise as Marxist Satanism, reads as lifted straight from a vampire hunter's manual. As Benshoff displays in Monsters in the Closet, listen to this monologue from 1964's Kiss of the Vampire.
The corruption of human beings by the devil can take many forms. Either he can seek God through the church and pray for absolution, or he can persuade himself that his filthy perversion is some kind of new and wonderful experience.
Now, tell me that wouldn't sound expected coming out of the mouth of some desiccated salamander who somehow keeps getting elected to the House of Representatives. Duskmourn, a set and a world about this complicated era where queerness was beginning to be portrayed and discussed, but infrequently and predominantly in demonizing, if subsequently recuperated ways, is challenged to contend with these kinds of archetypal narrative elements whilst updating sensibilities and retaining a 13+ rating. So how does it manage? To begin with, the decision to bring the non-binary planeswalker Nico Eris into this world, not to act as a victim but as an integral actor in defeating the House, is a phenomenal move. Non-binary identities are almost entirely lacking in this genre. By my count, there is the defiantly named Glenn/Glenda from Seed of Chucky, the gender-fluid child of the titular Chucky himself, and I could have also said Courtney from the animated horror comedy Dead End Paranormal Park, but Netflix made Hamish Steele stick to she/her pronouns for the actual show, and then cancelled it after 2 seasons. Fuck Netflix, justice for Gord. Nico, in contrast to this genre's trends, is front and centre of the action of this story, dispatching foes with shard magic, making active decisions, and maintaining their defining trait of defiance towards fate. They're presented well, whilst also not being handled with kid gloves, as other writers have often done when incorporating overlooked identities outside of their own into stories. Nico holds their own in combat, but is quick to take things personally and acts often on impulse, sometimes springing traps as a result. They resent the loss of their spark, the thing that allowed them to escape their fate on Theros, and makes that baggage a problem for the other planeswalkers they meet, additionally locking horns with Aminato within 5 minutes of meeting when they discover what her whole deal is. Nico's entire character, their good parts and flaws, centre agency and choice, a refreshing foil to the usual deterministic framing many queer allegories cement themselves in, a reflection of the bioessentialist born this way knee-jerk defence against bigotry. Nico here is adamant that they won't die in the house, a stance easily read as a metatextual insistence on the writer's part that queerness won't be a victim in this story. This is a subversion of the set's inspirations. Non-binary characters are strictly lacking from Duskmourn's source material, so let's not only include one, but make them the spotlight, both in how they stand centre stage, but also literally. Nico's shards being the only instance of sunlight seen in all of the art of all of the cards of this set. Also, Tyvar's ace. That's not confirmed by the story, but, he is a big asexual himbo, that is plain to see. He's also the most interesting black-aligned character in modern Magic, and he's my friend. Queerness also arises in the origins of this horror. In Duskmourn's 5th story in the main plot, Don't Give Up, we meet Marina, the daughter of the family who moved into this house, and read her diary. Her writing reveals that she is lonely, one of the weirdos, even suggesting suicidal thoughts intertwined with classically quote-unquote emo writing. She reports that she's discovered the presence in her basement, Valgavoth, who she begins to have a friendship with. A kinship and shared experience clearly develops as Marina begins getting bullied. Her diary accounts of these attacks are left intentionally incomplete, censored by tears smudging ink. She was called something obfuscated and clearly upsetting. We don't need to know what was said. Marina is a brown teenage girl, new to school with no friends and living in an evil, old, probably famously inexpensive house. Any number of cruel obscenities or their fantasy approximations could have been hurled at her. For most people, school is where the tyranny of in and out groups are first grappled with, where something as inconsequential as shoe choice or as bred by hatred like racism becomes imposed upon us by our peers. Children create monsters out of their classmates in fear of being the target of similar ire, and themselves become villains as a result. Eventually, Marina is convinced by Valgavoth, who she endearingly calls Val, to bring the bullies to the basement where, after a ritual, they are devoured, screaming by the walls in which he lives. Marina's following fearful entries detail how the house is expanding, devouring the neighbourhood as it begins to consume the plane. The relationship between Marina and Val is loaded with implication. To begin, they are reflections of each other, both being made to live in this house, both isolated from other connections, and both aching to punish those who have wronged them. The touch of Val trying to pretend he's not angry whilst he talks to Marina could be read as manipulation, and it probably is, but also reads like teenage angst. Like when in the bad Fright Night remake that I watched as part of an extended analysis of how it compares with the original in regards to queerness that, believe it or not, I cut from this video for time. I do that occasionally. I do edit my shit down. You have to believe me. There's a moment where the protagonist Charlie drops a beer whilst his vampiric neighbour Jerry is talking to him from outside their kitchen. It only lasts a moment, but Jerry struggles to contain his true feelings here.
Oh shit.
Can I help you with that?
No.
Sensing a chance to solicit entrance to the house, he all too quickly offers to help clean up, a needy stumble amidst his otherwise cool chauvinism. The performative misanthropy disguising real desire and impotency is adolescent and pitiful. In someone's emotional mask slipping, we become aware of the fact they've been wearing a mask at all and the insecurity implied in their decision to don one. Similarly, Val's power as it compares to Marina may well be that of the sun and a candle. However, in this moment, he needs her. He is as trapped as she is. Val may manipulate Marina into setting him free, but he also goes on to protect her. Marina walks through Duskmourn untouched, even unaware of the horror surrounding her. Peeled wallpaper writes itself when she enters a room, and she remains fixed in her youth. There is a warped solidarity here, found often in trauma bonds, and understandable to anyone who's found solace in connection with othered people. Val even manifests protectors for the house's other survivors. The Beasties, once the domestic pets of the world before, are masked, hulking, fuzzy beasts who find a purpose to live in providing safety and happiness for the people who the demon otherwise harvests. Val both consciously moved to give Marina the pleasant life that she was being denied and, consciously or not, makes beings to protect the vulnerable from his own cruelty. Not only is this queer as fuck, but also makes for the most interesting and compelling villain Magic has produced in years. Marina's place here too, as such a central and complicated figure in this story, is reflective of our present moment in horror media. Women have always existed in horror, both in front of and behind the camera, but most recently, horror films have developed into not just films with women central to them, but about womanhood. Midsommar, St. Maud, His House, A Quiet Place, Bones and All, Us, Invisible Man, The Lamb, Nanny, The Sensational Barbarian, and even shit ones like Stop Motion focus on womanhood, femininity, and the struggles therein across a range of different social and geographic settings. Almost as if the structures of our world tinge existing as a woman with constant threat and horror. Or something. Marina exists in contrast with the 80s archetypal character cutout which the Rescue Crew loosely represents. She is a small but vital element of modern horror in a sea of decaying illusions. Unlike the women in many of the most well-known horror flicks from Duskmourn's inspiration moodboard, the women of modern horror are not usually hapless victims who must, to quote Carrol Clover, realise her incipient masculinity to defeat evil. Rather, they are women until the end. Layered, imperfect, part monster, part hero, all human. More specifically, we could read Marina as an inversion of Amelia from the Babadook, where rather than confronting her trauma and containing it in the basement of her house, she feeds it and becomes the one peacefully imprisoned in a fortress of denial. On that, we can return briefly to my comparison between Valgavoth and Am from all those rooms ago. Both were brought to life with expectations and purpose in mind, denied base desire, and consumed by destructive rage as a result. A prisoner in your own body. Who amongst us hasn't at one point been on the outside of that magic circle? Never for me. I was in hell looking at heaven, and I began to hate. Whilst there's definite care and curiosity in the view of Val and Marina's queerness, there is also the expected and frustrating queerness inherent in presentations of the more nebulous, monstrous other. Mutant bodies, uncanny faces, kink-adjacent clothing, and the reliance of an ill-defined insanity to explain both the atrocities committed by the cultists, Wickerfolk and Razorkin, as well as justify the violence rendered onto them. I also beg that we push a little harder when it comes to naming our fantasy peoples. Call them Razor Fiends or the Wick Woven. I've had it up to my massive carnivorous eyeballs with the born, kin, and especially folk school of proper noun suffixes. Whoever named Glimmers, an evocative term which both captures the diminutive size of these spirits and one which exactly explains what they represent to survivors, did a great job. It would be a travesty if they were called Hopeborn or something equally silly. Listen to this person more in vision design. But I digress. Those who are evil in Duskmourn are disfigured, scarred, and contorted into uncomfortable shapes, whereas the survivors are only ever injured on a surface level up until the moment of their death. They are only mad in the instances where their mind is stolen by the cult or broken to the point of the death of self. And of course, none of them have any physical disabilities beyond the occasional pair of glasses. It is a frustrated act to ask for more understanding depictions and narratives about disability and the bodily other within horror. Physical or mental abnormality is an easy shorthand for artists to lock an audience into viewing a character as a threat, even if they haven't done anything threatening. In her contribution to It Came From the Closet, Zephyr Lizowski details the complicated relationship she has as a disabled person with The Ring remake, one of the many texts referenced in Duskmourn, and both the depiction of and audience reaction to Samara.
In the movie, the girl, Samara, had a father who called her evil and stomped around the house, and a mother who talked endlessly about how much she loved the girl. In the movie, the girl was locked in a medical treatment facility away from home, then once released, locked in a little room at the top of her family's barn. A point The Ring makes inadvertently is how interconnected all monstrosities are. The young dead girl who's the villain is different and sick, so she becomes a recipient of violence. She becomes a recipient of violence, so she becomes an enactor of violence. In 6th grade, I watched The Ring because it scared me, but also because it and its ilk taught me how to act. I took notes. The blonde woman was mean to her ex-husband because he was bad, and we feel sympathetic. The girl at the bottom of the well looked scary, so it didn't matter how badly she hurt. The stepfather was loud, but ultimately not guilty, and that makes him redeemable. Anyone who looks dissimilar to the norm ultimately becomes a threat.
Lizowski points out how, despite dozens of academic books and essays being penned on The Ring, mostly by empowered, able-bodied white people, none of the ones she has read so much as mention that Samara is sick and disabled. The horror of her body either brushed over or taken as a given to be monstrous. In the conclusion to her essay, she talks about how, instead of challenging these films, maybe the way forward is to acknowledge the gift they give, oblivious to their own framing. That sick bodies doing what they do, refusing to be stifled together, is one of the most radical things there is.
In The Ring, when the girl climbs up the well, her bones cracking out of place, bending behind herself, this is supposed to be a sign she's to be feared and pitied and isn't even human. When I discovered suddenly as a child that I could do the same thing, joints twisting out of place and then aching afterwards, when I discovered that myself, it felt like freedom.
Under the floorboards of Duskmourn, tread as they are by both film school clever and eye-rollingly vapid references, a basement lies stuffed both with quiet critique and subversions of the texts pastiched above, as well as the antique tropes that have been rendered as classic by their ubiquity. As refreshing as many of these subversions are, they are held back in part because Duskmourn cannot drop the fetters of marketability. One can only colour outside the lines so much before interesting storytelling and world-building comes at the cost of mass appeal and recognisability. Similar to how Kamigawa Neon Dynasty's designers insisted that this world would be a respectful and interesting examination of a fantastic East Asian future, only to include Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle references for fear that the Western consumer may not part with their cash unless every product is about them in some way. On that topic, however, one small inclusion I'm very glad to see in Duskmourn is that of Asian characters front and centre of this story. I'll let Viet Dinh's essay Notes on Sleepaway Camp speak as to why.
Slasher films almost never feature Asians. This invisibility became a protective cloak. We are neither killer nor victim, neither saved nor slaughtered. If I need to, I could slip undetected between worlds, between child and adult, black and white. I was the perpetual vice president lurking in the shadows of those higher in the chain of command. I would have to wait until Sleepaway Camp 3 Teenage Wasteland to see an Asian. By contrast, it took the Friday the 13th series 8 sequels before it had its first Asian.
Of course, Duskmourn isn't a story about Asian people in Western horror. More so a tale where characters who are normally pushed to the margins of a genre are instead placed in its spotlight. It's a tad disappointing that many Asian films and other movies from foreign markets that were being produced at this time, iconic and influential as they may have been, have only gotten reference treatments here, provided they had a successful US remake. It's a pervasive reminder that for all of the energy I'm sure the horror heads at Wizards put into the creation of this world, it is still a commodity to market. A cult classic Japanese film like Pulse or Kaido, the tale of ghosts invading the world through the burgeoning internet, eventually bringing about the apocalypse, seems like a shoo-in for Duskmourn. However, its 2006 American remake was widely panned, and as such, nary a nod to the film can be found. We don't have time for Hausu deep cuts. Hasbro's Gold Goose needs to meet its egg quota. I am certain that there are elements of queerness in Duskmourn that I haven't cottoned onto, let alone whether or not they breathe freshness into the old house of horror or simply move its stagnant air around. But here I do want to refocus on one element of the non-human world building that I think is honestly a masterstroke. It's a small inclusion, but both elevates the entire world of Duskmourn and engages with queerness as a feeling that I found both surprising and endearing. Let's talk about the Beasties. In Grant's stories and in the general world building for Duskmourn, the Beasties are presented as hulking inconsistencies, often both gargantuan and lithe, with asymmetrical features all sheathed in a carpet of fur and a series of masks. They exist as creations of the house, born from chrysalises only after the plane that Duskmourn became had been swallowed. They are the only sentient part of the world to be greatly warped by Valgavoth's ascension because of their adjacency to the concept of the house. Whilst goats have become haunted and crabs have evolved, the house cats and dogs of this world have been broken and rebuilt on a foundational level, much like the house which was their adopted or enforced environment. Ignoring the fact that some of them haven't, and normal dogs also exist in this set. Please let your writers and artists talk to each other. My knees are getting sore, I'm on them so much. Our main source of beastie lore comes from Grant's side story, Keep Them Alive. To begin, the Beasties wandered the house without purpose until their society's founder Spindlewright forged a protective mask and came across an adult survivor and their children being attacked by a cellar spawn. The Beastie felled the fiend, but not before the adult was slain, asking with their final breath for the Beastie to protect the children. Spindlewright accepts and, when met with a smile from the survivor, realises that protecting these creatures, these keep-alives as he understands them to be, is the Beastie's purpose in the house. However, as Spindlewright discovers, should any keep-alive a Beastie is protecting see under their mask to their true faces, they will be overcome with terror and flee into the house, either provoking inconsolable depression in the Beastie or a twisted protector instinct where the Beastie will stalk and kill their keep-alive. They know that a death at their hands will be better than a death alone in the house. Shannon Maguire wrote a DVD Extras blog post for this story, essentially her providing further context for her writing, and God bless her for doing so. In it, she points out how one of the lines of the narrative, quote, "Once a keep-alive has smiled at you, you will be theirs forevermore, even when they have left the house behind or been taken where you cannot follow," very much implies that Beasties abduct people who smile at them, creating an immediate, inseparable, and one-sided bond with someone. And I love the idea of turning the act of smiling in Duskmourn into a life-altering and devastating decision. That's just great. I love these characters for two main reasons. Firstly, Duskmourn's slashers and nightmares, demons and survivors, traps and dolls, and more are all at most one step removed from the horror media they're based on. The Beasties, however, are disconnected from these stories. Grant writes how both the voice and lore in Keep Them Alive is largely inspired by James Tiptree Jr.'s short story Love is the Plan is Death, the tale of a cannibalistic species of predators told from the perspective of one questioning their species' way of existing whilst being cannibalized by his mate. But the Beasties are also, as I alluded to them previously, deeply similar in motive and visual variety to the monsters from Where the Wild Things Are, which is, coincidentally, my mother's favourite children's book. Hi mum, love you lots, and thanks for lending me the handycam. If you leave a comment, I'll pin it. And if anyone in the replies is nasty to you, I'll fucking get them. The Beasties are kaleidoscopic monsters who predominantly protect children, but who, should that mask be removed, will eat them up. They love them so to speak. But these stories could be considered in the same ranks as Duskmourn's other inspirational horror media, in the same way that this video could be considered succinct. Sure, there are moments where that is true, but you'd be laughed at for making such a bizarre claim. Their place in this house feels inappropriate and ill-fitting given the rest of the aesthetic. What they have the effect of, however, is expanding the world beyond a simple canvas of pastiche. There is such a disparity between how the Beasties feel, look, and act in comparison to the rest of the setting and the texts which serve as its foundations. Like an eldritch horror in a fishing game, it cannot help but make the piece of media stand out from similar texts. To a lesser extent, I also extend this praise to the glimmers, the inadvertent spectral projections which guide and in some cases also protect the survivors, manifested from nothing and nowhere in the house. Both of these benevolent elements lack any kind of explanation for their existence, either in why they are how they are, or even how they came to be, and in lacking that, the world is given far more depth and contrast. Dark is only dark when in context of the light, and safety can only be removed when a fitting glimmer of security exists to begin with. What makes the Beasties special is that, through the lens of pastiche, we can justify the presence of other unexplained points in this world, but not them. The Jolly Balloon Man lacks any kind of formal lore, but we don't need any to work out what he's doing here. He is clearly a riff of corner case B-movie slashers such as the titular Ice Cream Man, by more specific way of Junji Ito's creepily camp The Hanging Balloons. However, we can't just glaze over the Beasties in the same way, because there exists no meta-textual reason for their inclusion, thus we have to engage with them on a literary level. They are creatures whose monstrous truth is both a boon to those they guard, and the looming peril which jeopardizes their relationship with those different to them. As any queer person growing up with friends who are better served by the supremacist structures in which we live can tell you, being considered an object of comfort and desire, and also of revulsion and threat, is a distinction separated by a razor-thin and sharp line. There is also a fascinating linguistic choice and point of view employed in this story. It is told from the perspective of the Beasties, and dramatic irony allows us to understand the realities implied by their perspectives. When they speak of legends about a time before the house, for example, we know them to be true. But when their otherness is presented here, it's done so from inside the other. Our structures of normality are confusing and unhelpful to them. Their reality is sacred, yet incoherent to us until explained from their perspective. Again, as any queer person can attest, it is always refreshing when our concerns are exposed and explored by us from our point of view, rather than that of an attraction-ogling tourist. Din puts it best.
There is a difference between feeling uncomfortable with your own body and having others proclaim how uncomfortable they are with you. Between the horror felt by a person and the horror caused by a monster.
This is to say that whilst Beasties do not actually exist, it is nonetheless gripping as a queer person to see the otherness of a monster meditated upon by the monster themselves. A point in Keep Them Alive that I find personally satisfying is the employment of it. For those of you unaware, I'm non-binary, or genderqueer, or honestly just throw a dart at a list of gender identities. So long as it doesn't have M or F in the word, I'm probably fine embodying the term. I also use it and its as pronouns. Fine with they and them, but a lot happier with the former. My reasons for this are arcane and convoluted even to myself, and I am neither willing nor able to articulate my personal experience of living as the body that I am in a YouTube video. If you want to talk about my gender with me, we will do so only using the fleeting immateriality of the spoken and unrecorded word. It'll be fitting. In the story, when Scrimbleshanks the Scary Cat comes across the harried Duskmourn survivors, he refers to them as its, the same as I am certain the Beasties would be referred to by us should they exist in the world. But it is not synonymous with aversion nor of belittling. It simply is the other. radical in its beloved neutrality. If I am to point to a literary shorthand to explain why the quote-unquote dehumanization of it, as used to refer to me, is quite the opposite of upsetting, it will be to these passages. To be the other is to be an it. We are all, depending on your angle, an other. Simply things with supremacy granted or denied to us through the chauvinistic structures in which we live. In understanding oneself as quote-unquote just an it, a conscious body, a part of the world as much as our neighbours, our wildlife and our snowfall, we may better grow to humbly appreciate our collective ever-changing place in all of this and strive for all forms of liberation. Or something like that. I don't fucking know. The masks are an intriguing addition to the Beasties. Whilst the rest of their form and behaviour is very Sendakist, which is just me trying to find a different way of saying based on where the world things are again, the masks and the terrible visages they cover are new, reminiscent of Spirited Away's No-Face as a powerful being who acts with both care and terrible violence. Again, the idea that despite all their best efforts, the Beasties must hide their true selves or else be fearfully shunned, often then becoming the very terrible monster they are made to feel they are, is the kind of queer metaphor which comes out of nowhere and gut punches you. Myra Grant, your writing is brilliant and I sincerely hope you pen more stories for Magic the Gathering. Now please take your hand off my throat. The mask specifically, as Sashiko Ragosa lays out in their essay on beauty and necrosis, is a familiar queer motif.
I passed my youth with my best mask forward. With the sprouting of a nexus upon my chest came a new pressure to perform, to act as something that my body signified to the rest of the world. As I grew older, a new form of masking was required of me, flagging my steady march towards a singular future. As girls and boys began to date, I found myself searching for this new cover-up, a flesh-made rendering of my normalcy. Queers use the term beard to describe this kind of union formed to hide the identity of one or both individuals.
In their essay, they examine the masked horror of Le Usant Visage. What, I can pronounce French properly when it's not the name of a philosopher? Get off my back! Eyes Without a Face is a 60s French horror film about a scarred woman and her surgeon father, determined to hide his daughter's scars, first with a porcelain mask and then with face transplants, stolen from kidnapped and murdered girls. In doing so, Ragosta lays out the connection between masks and queerness.
Dr. Genesier, who, faking his daughter's death, hiding her reflection, and insisting she only returns to society once her face is sufficiently beautiful, strips her of her humanity. He reduces her to her ability to fit into hegemonic standards of beauty. In this way, Eyes Without a Face can be read as a subversion of the stories that paint trans people as mass murderers, tricksters hiding some imagined biological truth. Trans people are reduced to our ability to fit some imagined but collectively reinforced standards of gender. The extent to which we meet these standards, however, does nothing to guarantee our safety. Even more so for trans people of color, as these standards are carved out of whiteness.
Ragosta goes on to describe transness as an unmasking, a stripping of a performance expected of us by way of biological essentialism. They point out how in the film, the daughter Christiane is considered in the film's own title not to have a face. But is a face of scars really not a face? To call her faceless is to ignore the fact that her face is a healed wound. Some of us are the scars of society, the admission of a wounded world. We break open publicly, a tearing of ourselves both literal via physical assault on marginalised people and figurative, in the untethering of ourselves from the narratives we were born into. Our breaking bears evidence of the liquidity and resilience of the human form, a fluidity that some experiences never melt into. To be queer is to be a wound. Yeah, I really like the Beasties. As has been ungraciously hammered into you over the past 2 hours or so, God, I need to fucking edit these scripts. Horror flicks are always about something. Whilst you can turn your brain off for a large number of action movies, and many romantic comedies don't attempt any deeper literary feat than putting two or more attractive people in farcical scenarios, the same is rarely true with horror. At its core, horror as a genre seeks to thrill and scare its audience, but to be scared of something requires that something be poisoned with fear to begin with. The gendered violence, complete with laughably phallic murder weapon of Slumber Party Massacre, for example, is a clear feminist satire of then contemporary horror flicks and their penchant for unthinking misogynistic violence. This is all to prime the question as to what Duskmourn is about and what Valgavoth represents. To begin, we get a pretty clear explanation as to why all of this evil fermented in Welcome Home, the very first side story released for this set. Magic was a scarce resource controlled by very few, and others yearned for the ease that it could bring. The people of what became Duskmourn learnt the art of summoning creatures from the lifeless void, beings of hunger and raw strength. It was small at first, creatures to enable strange machines to function, to ease lives, to power lights and preserve food. People began to summon greater and greater beings, never thinking ahead to what would happen if those beings ever broke free. And then one day, something too great to be controlled was bound here into a perfectly ordinary house on the outskirts of a perfectly ordinary city. We, of course, know what happens next. Humanity punished for meddling in things we oughtn't has been a mainstay of horror literature since forever. The natural order, the world in itself which humanity shapes into the world for us, comes back to haunt its manipulators with ironic curses or total destruction all of the time. Frankenstein prevents death to create life, and his creation causes death in its wake. The testing and horrific deployment of nuclear weapons awakens an ancient evil who brings nuclear fire into the heart of civilization. The mages of what became Duskmourn sought easy energy solutions for everyday convenience and doomed their world when Valgavoth broke containment. Each different period's existential anxieties, rapid electrical and medical developments, nuclear power and war, and the world-bending horrors wrought through energy consumption are laid out like tagged cadavers in its horror literature. The House of Duskmourn, a behemoth of human design, consuming natural abundance, rendering it hostile and unavailable too, is an allegory for global warming as a man-made catastrophe. Quote-unquote natural disasters like wildfires, floods, droughts and hurricanes are anything but when their intensity and frequency are directly due to the whims of capital and the pawns were sometimes allowed to elect to serve them. Duskmourn cuts through the frequently employed image of a world taking revenge on the people who have harmed it, and instead positions the doom of this world as the result of conscious action and pervasive structures which could well have been questioned and upended. Ones that we still have the opportunity to unmake, but only in increasingly impolite ways. This is also apparent in Dead End, with the elves viewing the consuming horror of the house as an evil of the city, by the city. In another inversion of perspectives, it is the people at the periphery of the city of industrial empire who view themselves as elevated from the horror as its creation was not their crime. In reality, those most responsible for climate catastrophe, the billionaire industrialists who other billionaires and their millionaire lackeys want you to worship like kings, live in gated communities, feeling insulated from the effects of their crimes against humanity, nestled in the imperial core, with those who have done the least to contribute to this crisis forced to shoulder its heaviest burdens. This is not the only understanding, of course. The image of a terrible monster sulking just beneath the surface of suburbia which will destroy the entire world if let out is about as plain a metaphor as you can get for the genocidal chauvinism which is growing new monsters throughout the West, staffed by affluent reactionaries fed on imperialist plunder yet hungry for fictional past glory. Even Marina's insulation from and seeming willful ignorance of this horror could be read as allegorical for our places in the imperial core. Sure, we have faced hardships because of who we are, who we love or what we choose to believe, but we are also kept docile and compliant through the actions of the monster that sustains our comparatively pleasant life. For all the woe that we face, as much as we hate or fear the beast that is threatening the world as a whole, we always revert to covering our eyes and ears when confronted with opportunities and calls to do something about it. So long as we are unwilling to relinquish the comfort granted by the monster who provides the table scraps of the good life, we will never understand or fight against the true horror which funds our relative comfort. The suffering will continue, and we will be complicit. Of course, there is a more fundamental theme, one we've been skirting around this entire video. The most complicated element of this world, both a fetter to its storytelling and its most fitting pillar: nostalgia. As Anna Bogutskaya writes in Feeding the Monster, trauma and nostalgia go hand in hand, and nostalgia is key to the houses of horror. Lured into a space and aesthetic we are familiar with and associate with fond memory, we are made more vulnerable and ripe for frights. Many horror films use a baseline aesthetic of safety to procure these spooks, such as a comfortable house turned cruel in Nightmare on Elm Street, or they subvert them with the cold council flat infested with ghosts of guilt and regret in the stellar His House. However, with the Haunted House of Duskmourn and other similar media, the source of nostalgia is found less in that of the house on its own, and more so the entire haunted house image as presented in the media we have previously escaped into. Our generations, here encompassing millennials and to a greater extent Gen Z and Gen Alpha, have been left with nothing. We have no materially better life that lies in our yesteryears, no gas for 2 cents a gallon, no cultural memory of a warm community which we rebelled against but now recall tenderly. We don't even have the falsehood of ignorance, where all of the problems that existed in the pasts of our parents were only made apparent to them as they aged. We were born into a troubled and known world. Taught in school about climate catastrophe, taught by experience about recessions and austerity, seeing images of owned family homes in film and TV as aspirations decades removed from reality. We have little hope of attaining the life sold to us by comfortable media outside of the ghastly necropolitics of property inheritance, if even that's the case. Then we had to contend with everything getting worse. War and genocide intensifying, a global pandemic, and the scant few people striving to change things from the top, either being sabotaged by ghastly liberals who want things to stay how they are, or surviving adjacent to power by becoming ghastly liberals themselves. It is no surprise, given the constant reminders of the horrors, that nostalgia has become so marketable over the last decade. Nostalgia in filmmaking has often operated on a 30-year cycle, as filmmakers grow up and try and replicate their childhood memories. In the 1970s, films like Grease and Back to the Future gave an idealised glossy image of life in the 50s. In the 2010s, horror films looked back on the idealised 80s and 90s, from It, Chapter 1 and 2, Fear Street, and Stranger Things. In amongst this malaise arose analogue horror, seen in the skin-tingling freeform additions to the Mandela catalogue or Kyle Edward Hall's more traditional Skinamarink. This is an internet-born trend of filmmaking that wields nostalgia not as a cloth to drape its horror in, but as the very source of its horror. Analog horror filmmakers use or ape technology they are often too young to recall. Home movie cameras with hissing audio and scrambled visuals. It is not a vision of their childhood in the way that the nostalgic horror of Stranger Things is, but more so presenting the voyeuristic or eerie absence of it. We have little to be nostalgic about, so we instead simulate nostalgia through symbols of other people's yesteryears, often in rueful desecrations. Additionally apt are games like 2016's Anatomy, a tour of a dark and empty house through a simulated 90s home movie camera lens. The game explores the idea of a house whose floor plan is first analogous with human anatomy, then a literal living thing, and finally a sentient and longing one. The space glitches on our subsequent returns. Doors slide into carpet, chairs clip into ceilings, tables disappear and reappear as visual artifacts in one session grow into veins in the next. The house is hungry, longing, resentful, vengeful. The house here isn't possessed by a demon, it simply is what it was built to be, and therein lies the deep horror. It is no surprise that a surge of independent, low-budget, tainted and deconstructed nostalgia in both games and film media arose concurrently with the COVID-19 pandemic. Isolated in houses and homes with little to do but consume media, we watched a bizarre mixture of comfort shows like kids' cartoons from our childhoods or even younger generations, simultaneously with self-flagellating explorations of the least appropriate subject matter imaginable. During the pandemic, horror streaming service Shudder reported record numbers of new subscriptions, and the most watched film on streaming was Contagion, Steven Soderbergh's meticulous anatomy of the spread of a new virus. Duskmourn was created in these same conditions, its development beginning whilst Western governments were still at least in the counting the dead phase of the pandemic, and releasing in those same governments' anti-life and anti-protest mask ban era. Duskmourn is approaching nostalgia in an artistic moment where horror nostalgia is all the rage, both co-opted and utopian. It is about isolation, being trapped inside inescapable walls, the world outside consumed by horrors of our creation, and also an example of the same sanded down nostalgia we flocked to in order to distract from the horrors of now. Its substance is the very thing its subtext is critiquing, and it could have gone so much further. Even the set's symbol plays into this. The moth's life cycle is reflective of Valgravov's ascension, from his lava form as a demon from beyond, to the pupa of his entrapment in the house, to the unveiling of his wings as he consumed and became the plane. But the selection of the moth as opposed to any other kind of transformative creature is metatextually apt. Moths are born anew in a form associated with immediate decay. Their larvae infest and devour unaired clothes and old carpets, living through the consumption of things whose time has passed. Duskmourn 2 is a brand new world introduced to us, bent over old media and cannibalizing it like Saturn. Both fresh and tired, both flame and moth. There is horror in realizing that we have leaned on escapism as a nepenthe for an awful world, and now even the boundless potentials of imagined realities are stagnating, only able to recreate other people's memories of fictional better days. When people are reminded that the era this set is based on exists 40 years in the past, jokes abound about how that's the real horror of Duskmourn. And yes, they're right. We can return to that quote from Thacker, of how horror is a non-philosophical way of engaging with the philosophy of the world without us, to explain in part our fascination with the horror genre. It's a means of grappling with difficult philosophy in entertaining and accessible ways. Not only that, but it is the genre which most readily and brazenly deals with otherness, be it in regressive or liberatory ways. It's easy to point to examples of the former, many of them making up the lion's share of now classic new horror media. But to focus only on the negative past is to do a disservice not only to the brilliant examples of past horror media with emancipatory and subversive texts, but also to what is being built today. Horror is in a renaissance, with stories that reflect many of the themes of the previous era, but with far more nuanced and understanding perspectives. It's not just old themes treated with better care either, but entire narratives which had previously been relegated to cruel twists, if they'd even been considered at all, given actual explorations in tales by and about the people who live these realities. As we've discussed, sexual and gender queerness has long been an unacknowledged or misappropriated element of horror. From the plethora of films which equivocate deviation from the gender binary as nefarious, Psycho, Dressed to Kill, Insidious 2, etc., to incorrect analysis of the state of the modern horror genre, see the laughable falsehood from 2011's Scream 4.
In fact, the only surefire way to survive a modern horror movie, you pretty much have to be gay.
Are we fucking sure about that? But in this new era of horror, far more interesting examinations of queerness are starting to pick up after a decades-long reactionary hangover. I Saw the TV Glow is a slow burn chiller that puts transness, queerness, media, and the passive horror of normality on full display. It's also got an almost perfect split of 5-star and 1-star reviews online, which, of course, means it's fucking fantastic. I want to explain it in more detail because there are so many visual and thematic moments in it which brush against Duskmourn. In the movie, a woman-led Monster of the Week show a la Buffy the Vampire Slayer called The Pink Opaque provides grounding and meaning for Owen as he grows up in a world of dull suburbia, meaningless jobs, and the swift passing of both time and the lives of his family. He connects with another high schooler, a gay girl called Maddie who watches The Pink Opaque with him and becomes convinced that she and Owen are the lead characters from the show. She is Tara and Owen is Isabel. In the plot, the girls have been forced into the Midnight Realm by the show's villain, Mr. Melancholy, and Maddie is convinced that they have to escape the realm, this reality, and finish the final season. Owen rejects her offer to exit reality and re-enter the show, fleeing back to normality, and time passes in a hard cut. Owen rewatches The Pink Opaque when it comes on streaming services, but finds no joy in the show anymore. It's nothing like he remembers. It's cheap, childish, and embarrassing. Things come to a devastating head during an asthma attack at a child's birthday party in Owen's latest dead-end job. He seems to come to a realization and screams for Maisie/Tara to save him, screams that he's dying, screams for his mum, whilst everyone around him refuses to react like deactivated animatronics. He goes to the bathroom and cuts open his chest, revealing the glow of the TV underneath his skin. He bathes in it, his worsening asthma swallowed by the crackle of static, before he puts his clothes back on and stumbles back to work, blaming his outburst on new medication, his asthma the worst it's been the entire film. I can see why people didn't like it. It's a focused meditation on our connection to media, how we project ourselves onto it and see ourselves reflected in turn, how reality is designed to suck the life out of you, and how awareness of that, of not fitting into the role that people around you want you to, can lead both to personal liberation, with Maisie/Tara when it's implied she returns to the show, or to the loss of self, ruin, and harm, should your truth be repressed, necessarily or not, from within or without. The writing is jarring in a way that elicits a dreamlike atmosphere. The performances are strained with naturalistic interactions jutting up against fourth wall breaks and monologues about impossible situations, forever causing us to doubt, much as Owen/Tara does, which reality is reality, which is the show, which self is performance. The one you've grown up believing is the truth, or the one you know in your chest is real. The negative user reviews, fittingly as well, end up sounding like the characters in the film who mock Owen/Tara's peculiar way of being. The film wants you to recognise its brilliance. It has low self-esteem, so it just winds up being a boring analogy of existential dread that, for the most part, never even needed to be expressed in such a tediously overcompensated way. I swear, if you showed these people Twin Peaks today, they'd have a fucking aneurysm. This is what, to me, makes Duskmourn such a frustrating horror text. This is the landscape in which it lives. These are the pieces of horror media chomping at the bit to examine the horror genre and horror texts in creative and deconstructive ways. There are so many clear examples of the creative team behind it striving for something interesting. Like an original concept for a horror setting, a living comment on our recycled culture and its ever-diminishing lack of meaning. In a world where nothing new grows, only the old remains in increasing states of decay. The same as a zombie references a sport from a civilization over a century removed from the present, one has to ask what it is that we're making today that can be looked back on nostalgically in 40 years' time. Will streaming platforms still be making alien flicks in 2064? Are we already trapped in a house where only the past exists as an anchor to cling to? Are we already just watching the TV glow? But all of these ideas, these horror potentials, are suffocated by the very thing they seek to deconstruct. For every fresh paragraph in the world-building documentation, there is an immediately tired reference to a horror movie, or even trends in horror movie production. For every tasteful and subtle allusion to the genre, there's a jarring imposition of an image utterly inconsistent with the plot, as explored so brilliantly by Grant and others. In Duskmourn, nostalgia as horror fights constantly with horror as nostalgia. Even the special treatment cards demonstrate these wild swings. with the mirror monster and lurking horror alt art using magic's alternative treatment capabilities to enhance suspense in a player's engagement with this game world, to the myriad other special treatments which do little but pad collectability. Stretched art, paranormal frames, borderless rooms and lands, 3 versions of the double exposures, standard, monochrome, and textured. The double exposures and paranormal, aka CRT frames, acting as what Mark Fisher calls materialized memory, the principal signature of hauntology. Their art and framing purposefully antiquated, making us aware that we are viewing a time that is out of joint. In attempting to recapture the past in this cynical way, all it succeeds in doing is reminding us that what came before is haunting the now. It won't allow us to fall into the illusion of presence. The mix of archaic visuals and flashy treatments clash like splicing footage from a 1990 Sony Handycam with audio recorded on a modern microphone. Wait, has this thing been on? There are even fracture foil full arts, which, much as I am personally a fan of the look in a vacuum, transform what are billed as apexes of the house's many terrors into feeling far more like Halloween Pokemon evolutions. Like, these work on the glimmers. Did we really need to make the mythic rare Overlord cycle even more collectible? Hasbro says yes, I guess. Much earlier in this video, I talked about how horror's low-budget trend informed much of its substance. I cannot avoid the irony of Magic attempting to recapture many of those same feelings in what might be its most collectible and treatment-heavy set thus far, especially considering the Second Wind monetization of its Nightmare bundle, which released after the original product shipped with even more unique and collectible commodities. Really, the story of Duskmourn, not its plot, but the story of the set, is the story of late Magic. Of creatives desperately trying to engage with tired themes in critical ways and produce radically new experimental images, only to be cowed into also replicating easy-to-advertise tropes. Duskmourn is a house of horror, at times brilliant, but in equal ways saddled with the worst traits of modern Magic design. In the game's story, Duskmourn is a house haunted by the sins of a dead society's past transgressions. In our story, Duskmourn is a house haunted by itself. Ah! The demon's curse! Oh no, the Firstly, a massive thank you to Cool Stuff Inc. for sponsoring this video, as well to the Rondo Theatre for letting me shoot in their space, and a principal thank you to Leo Vees for being director of photography on location. A thank you as well to the Rascal Ristic Studies, the essayist H. Bomber Guy, the brain genius Dr. John Duncan, the format shaper Lua Stardust, the comedian Ife Wadiwe, the poet Catherine O'Driscoll, the artist KilnFiendPotter, and the cosplayer Z for contributing their time and voices to this piece. As always, this video would not exist without my patrons, especially my $10 and up patrons, whose names I will now rapidly read in order to keep this video under 3 hours long. Thank you to Mopkins, 1234 I declare a class war, 3D0, a communist right dimple, a delicious slice of poultry, a filthy communist bunny, a gay American couple, a German teacher in Oklahoma, a returning abuser of their power to make Spice Iraq announce that everyone not bought Chariots of Steel will be hunted for sports. A small sheep holding a large knife, a treasure token featuring Spice Iraq's face, a waste of a perfectly good skeleton, A, B, C, D, F, E, G, H, K, I, J, L, N, M, O, P, Q, S, R, T, V, W, U, X, Y, Z. Adam Gable, Aesthetic Dialectic, Agent Maxwell, AJ Ingram, Alesha Khanin, Alex Berman, Alex D. Siswai, Alice Perales, Ali, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists, Baka Idaka, probably Tibble's persona, I draw penises on pastries, an entire council of ghosts, an exhausted capybara, Andrew Elf, Anne Morgana. Anthrocarbon thinks Turnitin can suck so many dicks it could orally identify any dick whilst blindfolded and underwater. Ah, a fellow academic. Astra Jade, Austin L, Bacchus98, Basu Gasu Bakuhatsu Bakumatsu, Burbseed, Blake Evers, Blue aka Selvala will forever be my number 3 waifu, just don't get Panglacial Worm involved. Bloodogun, Brian Dunn, Bridget Huan Tong, Bry Director H.K. Bergdahl, Carl, or is it Carl? That is the question. Charles Cohen, Chris DeVos, Clayton Spezia, Cognitive Glitch, Conflicted Psyches, Connor Rentz, Cube Artisan, Daniel Morris, Darius Rudeminer, David Reynolds, Dr. Rhino, Duncan Lindsay, Earl Grey T, Edward Gordon, Eric Lindhall, Errant Lanthe, Etienne Chapion Masson, Yves Misgala, Faxel, Felix Mortem, Frozen Monarch, Future Beagle, Gayula, Queen Among Bears, Georgi Lyubanov, Georgina Coffey, Gitu Nullmage, Gub, Guilty Sonder, Horny Badger, House Rule, Hooper Dup, Hypercube MTG, I Am Kaz, I assume Chandra's rug matches her drapes, but I'd still tap that like the target land of her revolution. Imbecilicus Rex, in response I bolt myself, in response table flip, in response I mental misstep your bolt, paying 2 life, in response I proceed to lay down and cry. New law, new law! Jackson Crispin, Jackson Seamare, Jackson West, Jason LaRue, Jennifer Klein, Joel F., John Sheridan, Joseph Schultz, Josh, Joshua M. Stephan, Julius Home, Kai Sandham, Keir Starmer's Tory Socks, Khans of Tarkir is anti-Sultai revisionist propaganda, Kimoli, let Zimone say fuck, Rio, I imagine that you're pretty happy with this video, Kyle Denley, Leone, lover of dragons, Lewis, Lobo Loco loves Topo Chico, Lysius, Linnea, Madame Monroe, Magic Arcanum, Magic Fellow, Mars Faye, Max, Menti, the Mage, Metal Gamer 21, Mika, Moose, Morbid Panda, Maury Robbins, Not Witty, Nathan Brinson, Nathan Speepisman Harris, Nemo Dakar, Num 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 Num, Yoshi! Knox, a trans otter, finally found some peace in Bloomborough, Omar Altibai. One day I will float into the sky like a balloon and my helium will be lost forever. One of the many people who cried 4 hours, 8 minutes and 38 seconds into the Tarkir video. One single Mungus. Paper Crane the Cuddle Demon, Pappy Markov was a mistake, Peroxide, Peter Carter, Phoenix Swans, Pivo, Huasu, Raghavar Kavali, read this, I always mess this one up, read this in the voice of Werner Herzog. Robin, Rossom, Samuel Kona, Scrimblow, Bimblow, The Lovable Scronko, Several Goblins in a Trench Coat, Sean Pitry, Skolaton, Skyfire, Sorry Zia, Zars, Refined Grizzly, the A-positive blood type goddess of death, the anarchist insert to the world's strangest grocery sitcom, the entire B-movie script, the Jellybean Warlock, the Tamio Memorial Orphanage of Kamigawa, the Morrick, the one who plays, Thomas Quinlan, Thomas Saint, Totally a Spy, aka He Who Simps for Emrakul, hashtag She Has Returned to Us, hashtag I Told You She'd Return, Travis K, Twilord, Undead Herbs, Uranix Satyrix, War Crimes Uwu, Well You Asked For It, Wesley, that rat bastard communist, When I Close My Eyes, Niall Sylvain is there, watching, waiting, smiling, Whirlwind Abyss, Whiskey Jack, White Orchid Wayfarer, Will Drame, William Lyndon Smith, Wolf and Stoat, a gay Americana love story, Worston Show, Yeah, Yorick Brekov, Yuki Akama, Zach G, Xanoron, and Zoidistic. And of course, a massive thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon, no matter what tier, and especially a massive thank you to my Patreon Discord mods, Eris, Helena, Ori, and Skyfire. Without your work, we wouldn't have a nice little place for fans of the channel to congregate peacefully and lovelily. So yeah, I don't know if you can tell, I'm really bloody tired. So I'm going to wrap this up and say, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video, which will be the video that I promised I was going to make before I started writing the Duskmourn script. And as always, stay spicy.